Hey guys, tonight we are climbing aboard a Viking longship. And I mean really climbing aboard, squeezing your body between sweaty shoulders and salt-crusted wool, feeling the pitch of the North Atlantic tilt the deck beneath your feet, while 40-odd warriors grunt, snore and pass wind in a space roughly the size of a modern school bus. You can smell it already, can't you? That thick cocktail of fish oil, damp wood, unwashed armpits, and something else, something unmistakably human, rising from the bilge like a ghost that refuses to leave the party. This is not the cinematic Viking experience. There is no dramatic orchestral swell, no wind-tousled hero gazing meaningfully toward distant shores. There is instead a guy named Bjorn 3 feet away from you who desperately needs to relieve himself, and is eyeing the gunwale with an expression that says he's about to do exactly that. Welcome to the real Viking age. Now here's the thing that should genuinely terrify you. You probably won't survive this. Not because of enemy swords or sea monsters or even scurvy, but because one poor sanitation decision, one bucket tipped wrong, one sip of contaminated water, one handshake with the guy who didn't wash after his morning constitutional, and you're writhing with dysentery while the North Sea couldn't care less. And yet, somehow, the Vikings did survive. They crossed the Atlantic centuries before Columbus was a twinkle in anyone's eye. They raided monasteries, established trade routes stretching from Baghdad to Newfoundland, and colonised Iceland, Greenland, and briefly North America, all while managing to not die en masse from the biological nightmare of their own waste aboard cramped wooden ships. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tonight we're going to unravel this mystery piece by smelly piece. We'll talk about the ropes Vikings clung to while doing their business over open water. We'll explore the bucket systems, the bilge flushing techniques, the weekly bathing rituals that made Norsemen ironically cleaner than many of their medieval neighbours. We'll meet the herbs they stuffed in their clothes, the lanolin-soaked wool that basically cleaned itself, and the brutal but effective quarantine protocols when disease did break out. This is the unsexy history, the history that doesn't make it into the sagas, but it's the history that made those sagas possible. Before we dive in, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love imagining this little community scattered across the globe, all of us drifting off together to tales of ancient hygiene practices. There's something weirdly beautiful about that. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on the dock at Hedeby, one of the great trading hubs of the Viking world, somewhere around the year 890 CE. The air smells of tar, fish guts and ambition. Before you sits the vessel that will be your home for the next several weeks, a longship roughly 70 feet in length, its oak planks curving upward in that iconic serpentine silhouette, a carved dragon head mounted at the prow with empty eyes that seem to judge your hesitation. The ship is beautiful, you'll admit that much. It's also terrifyingly exposed. Unlike the enclosed vessels you might picture from later centuries, ships with cabins and holds and something resembling privacy, the Viking longship is essentially an open canoe on steroids. There is no below-deck refuge, there is no captain's quarters, there are rowing benches, a single mast that can be raised or lowered, and whatever cargo and supplies have been lashed down beneath oiled canvas. That's it. That's your world now, and you'll be sharing it with somewhere between 30 and 80 people, depending on the size of the ship and the nature of the voyage. On a raiding expedition, it's mostly warriors, men in their physical prime, each one eating roughly 3,000 calories a day, and producing the corresponding biological output. On a colonization voyage to Iceland or Greenland, you might have entire families aboard, women, children, elderly folks, maybe even a thrall or two, plus livestock. Yes, livestock, goats, sheep, possibly a cow if you're feeling optimistic about the voyage length. Each of those animals also eats and drinks and produces waste, and none of them have been trained to use a designated corner of the ship. The first thing you notice as you step aboard is how low the freeboard sits. That's the distance between the waterline and the top edge of the hull. In a Viking longship, it's often just 3 or 4 feet. This was intentional. A low freeboard made the ship faster, lighter, and capable of navigating shallow rivers that deeper-hulled vessels couldn't dream of entering. It's why Vikings could sail up the Seine to raid Paris, or navigate the Dnieper rapids on their way to Constantinople. But that low profile also means that in rough seas, Waves regularly splash over the sides. The ship is perpetually damp. The bilge, that lowest internal section of the hull, is constantly collecting seawater that seeps through the clinker-built planks. Now, here's where things get interesting from a sanitation perspective. That constant influx of seawater sounds like a nightmare, and in many ways it is. But it also created an accidental flushing system. Any waste that made its way into the bilge got diluted and eventually bailed overboard during the routine work of keeping the ship from sinking. The Vikings didn't design their ships with waste management in mind. They designed them for speed, flexibility, and the ability to beach on any coastline. But the resulting architecture happened to prevent the worst accumulations of human filth. You find your spot among the rowing benches, wedging yourself between a barrel of salted herring and a coil of rope that smells like it's been soaked in seal fat. The man to your left introduces himself as Ulf, and he's already eyeing the horizon with the 1,000-yard stare of someone who's done this before. The man to your right doesn't introduce himself at all. He just grunts and adjusts the axe at his belt. You realise, with a sinking feeling, that you'll be sleeping next to these men, eating next to them, and yes, dealing with the biological consequences of a shared diet in very close proximity to them. Historians still argue whether Viking crews developed formal rotation systems for sleeping arrangements, or whether it was a chaotic free-for-all determined by strength and social standing. The sagas don't spend much time on these details. They're too busy describing heroic duels and magical ravens. But archaeological evidence and comparative analysis with later Scandinavian maritime traditions suggest there was at least some structure. You probably had a designated spot that was yours for the voyage, and you probably defended it with the same territorial instinct that modern commuters defend their favourite seat on the subway. As the ship pushes off from the dock, oars dipping in unison, you feel the first roll of the sea beneath you. It's gentler than you expected, almost soothing, and for a moment you let yourself believe this won't be so bad. The coastline shrinks, the sun catches the spray. Somewhere behind you, someone begins to sing a rowing chanty in Old Norse, the rhythm matching the stroke of the oars, and there's a strange beauty to it all. Then Bjorn stands up, shuffles to the side of the ship, fumbles with his trousers, and you remember exactly what kind of journey you've signed up for. The Vikings called it going to the rail, though the actual Old Norse terminology varied by region, and probably by the coarseness of the speaker. What it meant was simple. When nature called, you answered by positioning yourself at the gunwale, the upper edge of the ship's side, and doing your business directly into the sea. There was no alternative. There were no porta potties bolted to the deck, no enclosed latrines tucked behind the mast. The ocean was your toilet, and the rail was your throne. This might sound primitive, and in some ways it was. But it was also remarkably practical. Human waste deposited directly into the ocean dispersed almost immediately. There was no accumulation, no festering pit of disease-breeding filth. The sea handled the problem with an efficiency that landlocked sanitation systems wouldn't match for centuries. In a weird way, Viking ships were cleaner than many medieval cities specifically, because they didn't try to store waste. They exported it instantly to an environment that could process it. Of course, going to the rail came with its own challenges. The North Atlantic is not known for its calm demeanour. Waves pitch the ship. Wind gusts at unexpected moments. The rail itself is slippery with spray. More than one Viking, historians suspect, met an inglorious end by losing his balance at precisely the wrong moment and tumbling into frigid waters while his crewmates watched in horror. Or, let's be honest, probably laughter followed by horror. The sagas don't record these deaths, but the sagas also don't record a lot of mundane disasters. They're not interested in the guy who fell overboard while peeing, they're interested in the guy who slew a dragon. To mitigate this risk, crews developed a simple but effective safety system, the buddy rope. You didn't go to the rail alone. You went with a length of rope tied around your waist or gripped firmly in one hand, the other end secured to the ship or held by a crewmate. It was a small humiliation, needing someone to literally hold your line while you relieved yourself, but it was better than the alternative. Pride is a luxury the North Atlantic doesn't permit, and so the rhythm of shipboard life established itself. Row, rest, eat, sleep, and several times a day, make your way to the rail with whatever dignity you could muster. The system worked. It wasn't elegant, but it kept the ship habitable, and that was all that mattered. The longship beneath you is a masterpiece of engineering, though you probably don't appreciate that yet. Not with your back aching from the rowing, and your nostrils full of smells that would make a modern health inspector weep. But take a moment to look around, really look, and you'll start to understand why this particular vessel design dominated northern waters for 3 centuries and enabled one of the most impressive maritime expansions in human history. The hull is clinker-built, which means the oak planks overlap each other like the scales of a fish, each one riveted to its neighbour with iron nails and sealed with a caulking mixture of tar and animal hair. This construction method creates a hull that's both strong and flexible. It can twist and bend with the waves rather than fighting against them, which reduces the stress on the wood and makes the ship far more seaworthy than the rigid-hulled vessels other cultures were building at the time. It also, and this is important for our purposes, creates natural drainage channels. Water that splashes aboard or seeps through the planking doesn't pool on deck. It runs down between the overlapping boards and collects in the bilge, where it can be dealt with systematically. The deck itself is open to the sky. You've noticed this already, of course. It's impossible not to notice when rain starts falling and there's nowhere to hide. But the implications for sanitation are significant. Open decks mean constant airflow. The wind that chills your bones and cracks your lips is also carrying away the worst of the odours, preventing the build-up of noxious gases that plagued enclosed ships in later centuries. Viking longships smelled bad, don't get me wrong, but they didn't smell as bad as they could have, and that distinction matters when you're talking about disease prevention. The shallow draft, typically just around 20 inches when fully loaded, meant the ship sat high in the water relative to its length. This made it blindingly fast. Some estimates suggest longships could achieve speeds of 15 knots under optimal sailing conditions, which is remarkable for any pre-modern vessel. But it also meant waves constantly washed over the low sides. In rough weather, you'd spend as much time bailing as rowing. This was exhausting, demoralising, and occasionally dangerous. It was also inadvertently hygienic. All that seawater sloshing through the ship acted as a continuous rinse cycle, diluting and flushing any organic matter that had accumulated in the bilge. Historians still argue whether the Vikings understood this hygienic benefit, or whether it was simply a lucky side effect of design choices made for other reasons. The evidence suggests the latter. Viking shipwrights were optimizing for speed, maneuverability, and the ability to land on beaches without harbour infrastructure. They weren't thinking about waste management, but the same features that made longships military and commercial marvels also happened to create a reasonably sanitary environment, at least by medieval standards. The mast, a single pine trunk that could be raised or lowered depending on conditions, sat roughly amidships. When sailing was possible, the crew could rest their aching arms and let the wind do the work. When the wind died or blew from the wrong direction, up came the oars again. The sail itself was made of wool, often coated with fat or tar to make it somewhat water-resistant, and it could be adjusted with a system of ropes that allowed for surprisingly sophisticated handling. What you might not realise, watching that great woolen square billow overhead, is that the sail also served as a kind of makeshift shelter. In heavy rain, it could be lowered and draped over the ship as a tent, creating a temporary enclosed space that offered some protection from the elements. This was not comfortable. You'd be huddled with your crewmates in a damp, dark, wool-smelling cave, listening to the rain drum against the fabric while the ship rocked beneath you. But it kept the worst of the weather out, and it meant that in true emergencies, storms so violent that going to the rail would be suicide, there was at least the option of using the bucket system we'll discuss shortly. The sail tent wasn't designed for sanitation purposes, but like so many aspects of longship design, it ended up serving multiple functions. Speaking of the hull, let's talk about that bilge for a moment, because it's going to be important throughout our journey. The bilge is the lowest internal part of the ship, the space below the deck planking where water naturally collects. In a clinker-built vessel, some water infiltration is inevitable. The caulking is good, but not perfect, and every wave that washes over the sides adds to the accumulation. Left unchecked, bilge water would eventually swamp the ship, so it has to be removed constantly through a process called bailing. Bailing is exactly what it sounds like, scooping water from the bilge with buckets or specially designed bailing scoops and throwing it overboard. It's tedious, repetitive, physically demanding work, and it never ends. Someone is always bailing on a longship at sea, even in calm weather. The Vikings developed a rotation system for this. Everyone took their turn at the bailing station, regardless of rank, because everyone understood that the alternative was sinking. What makes the bilge relevant to our sanitation story is what else ended up in it besides seawater. Despite best efforts to use the rail, not every bodily function could be safely performed over the side. Sometimes seas were too rough. Sometimes illness struck and mobility was limited. Sometimes it was the middle of the night and stumbling to the rail in the dark seemed like an unnecessary risk. In these cases, the bucket came out, a wooden vessel kept specifically for emergency waste, and the contents of that bucket eventually joined the bilge. The bilge, therefore, was not clean. It was a slurry of seawater, fish scales, food scraps, animal waste if you had livestock aboard, and yes, human waste from the bucket system. It smelled exactly as bad as you're imagining. But here's the crucial point. It was also constantly being diluted by incoming seawater and constantly being removed through bailing. The concentration of dangerous pathogens never had a chance to reach critical levels because the system was in perpetual flux. It was disgusting, but it was manageable disgusting. The ship also featured storage compartments formed by the spaces between the ribs of the hull, covered by removable deck planks. These were where supplies were stashed: dried fish, smoked meat, barrels of water, personal belongings, weapons not currently in use, trade goods if this was a merchant voyage. The smart Vikings, and they were generally pretty smart about such things, kept food storage as far as possible from the bilge bailing station. They might not have understood germ theory, but they understood cause and effect. Food stored near the filthy bilge went bad faster and made people sick. Food stored toward the bow, away from the worst of the moisture, lasted longer and stayed safer. Now, you might be wondering about sleeping arrangements, and this is where things get uncomfortable. There were no bunks. There were no hammocks. Those wouldn't be introduced to European ships until centuries later, borrowed from Caribbean indigenous peoples. There was just the deck, the rowing benches, and whatever you could use to cushion yourself against the hard oak planks. Most Vikings brought their own sleeping gear: a cloak of heavy wool or fur, perhaps a leather sleeping sack if they were particularly prepared, and their sea chest, which served double duty as a rowing seat during the day and a pillow at night. You slept where you sat, essentially. Your sea chest beneath your rowing position was your entire personal space for the duration of the voyage. Maybe 2 feet by 3 feet of deck that belonged to you and you alone. This was where you kept your spare clothing, your weapons, your small personal items. This was where you slept, curled around your possessions like a dragon guarding its hoard. And this was as close to privacy as you would ever get. The intimacy of these arrangements is hard to overstate for modern listeners. You weren't just near your crewmates, you were touching them. In cold weather, this was actually a survival advantage. Body heat shared among tightly packed men could mean the difference between shivering through the night and sleeping relatively warm. But it also meant that personal hygiene became a community concern in ways we'd find deeply uncomfortable today. Your smell was everyone's smell. Your lice were everyone's lice. And if you got sick, the chances of containing that illness to just your little 2x3 territory were effectively zero. The Vikings understood this, at least intuitively. They developed social norms around cleanliness that we'll explore in more detail later, but the basic principle was simple. You kept yourself as clean as conditions allowed, not just for your own comfort, but because your crewmates would make your life miserable if you didn't. The sagas occasionally mention men being mocked or ostracized for being unusually dirty, suggesting that there was a baseline expectation of hygiene even in an environment where true cleanliness was impossible. The ship moves beneath you now, finding its rhythm in the swells. The coastline has disappeared entirely, replaced by an endless grey expanse of water and sky that merge at the horizon until you can't tell where one ends and the other begins. Somewhere ahead lies your destination. Maybe the Scottish coast for raiding, maybe the Faroe Islands for trading, maybe Iceland for settlement. You don't know how long this voyage will take. No one does. Viking navigation was remarkably sophisticated, using sun compasses, observation of bird behaviour, knowledge of whale migration patterns, and an almost mystical sense of dead reckoning passed down through generations. But even the best navigator couldn't predict weather, and a journey that should take a week could stretch to a month if the winds refused to cooperate. That uncertainty shaped every aspect of shipboard life, including sanitation. You couldn't conserve resources based on a fixed timetable, because there was no fixed timetable. You had to balance immediate needs against unknown future demands, maintaining health and cleanliness as best you could. while never knowing how long those supplies would need to last. It's a precarious existence, beautiful in its way. There's something primal about being so utterly dependent on wind and wave and the skill of your companions, but precarious nonetheless. And in that precariousness, in that constant improvisation, the Vikings developed systems of waste management that kept them alive when by all rights they should have succumbed to disease. You feel it building before you consciously acknowledge it. That familiar pressure in your lower abdomen, the body's polite then insistent notification that certain biological processes require your attention. You've been putting it off, pretending you could ignore it a little longer, but there's no ignoring it now. You need to go to the rail. The ship is moving at a good clip, wind filling the sail, deck tilting slightly to starboard as the vessel heels into the breeze. Around you, your crewmates are engaged in the 1,000 small tasks that occupy sailors between crises, mending gear, checking rigging, sharpening weapons, playing dice games with walrus, ivory pieces worn smooth by generations of idle hands. Nobody's paying attention to you specifically, but everyone is aware of everything on a ship this size. There are no secrets here. There is no real privacy. And what you're about to do, while entirely natural and necessary, still requires a certain amount of choreography. First, you catch the eye of the man nearest to you, Ulf, as it happens, the veteran who's been doing this for years. You don't say anything. You don't need to. A slight nod, a glance toward the gunwale, and he understands immediately. He reaches for a coil of rope kept specifically for this purpose, a length of braided hemp about 15 feet long, one end already fashioned into a simple loop. This is the buddy system in action, and it's as old as Viking seafaring itself. The loop goes around your waist or under your arms, depending on preference, and Ulf braces himself against the rowing bench, paying out slack as you make your way to the side of the ship. If you go over, he'll haul you back. If he can't haul you back alone, he'll shout, and others will help. The system isn't foolproof. Nothing is foolproof on the open ocean, but it dramatically improves your odds of surviving what should be a completely routine bodily function. You reach the gunwale and grip it with both hands, feeling the worn smoothness of wood that's been grabbed this way by hundreds of men before you. The ship rises and falls with the swell. Spray mists your face. You wait for the rhythm because timing matters here. You want to do your business during the relatively stable moment between waves, not at the peak of a roll when the deck is tilting and your balance is compromised. There, a moment of relative calm. You position yourself, trousers loosened, leaning out over the water while your legs hook against the hull for stability. Behind you, Ulf keeps the rope taut but not tight, giving you room to maneuver while maintaining his grip on your lifeline. You try very hard not to think about the absurdity of this situation. A grown person, presumably a warrior or trader of some reputation, dangling over the North Atlantic with his pants down while a colleague holds a rope tied around his midsection. Historians still argue whether women on these voyages used the same basic system, or whether modifications were made for anatomical differences. The evidence is limited since the sagas were written primarily by men who weren't particularly interested in documenting female hygiene practices. But analysis of later Scandinavian maritime traditions suggests that some form of simple seat or sling arrangement may have been available for those who needed it. A plank with a hole, essentially, that could be positioned over the gunwale and secured with ropes to create a slightly more stable platform. Whether this was standard equipment or an improvised solution that varied by ship and crew remains unclear. What we do know is that the basic principle held regardless of gender. Waste went directly into the sea, immediately, with no intermediate storage. This was the primary system, the default approach, the way things were done under normal circumstances. The ocean was the toilet, and the ocean was infinitely patient. You finish your business and make your way back to your spot, handing the rope off to the next person who needs it. Because there's almost always a next person, on a ship with this many people sharing this much fermented fish. The whole process took maybe 3 minutes, and now you won't have to think about it again for several hours. That's the beauty of the system. It's quick, it's efficient, and once it's done, it's done. No lingering odours, no festering waste, no buckets to deal with. Well, mostly no buckets to deal with. We'll get to the exceptions. The social protocols around this daily necessity were both formal and informal, varying somewhat from crew to crew, but sharing certain common elements. You didn't interrupt a man at the rail unless there was a genuine emergency. a sail torn loose, an enemy ship on the horizon, something that genuinely couldn't wait. You didn't mock or comment on the process while it was happening, though gentle teasing afterward was apparently acceptable in most crews, and you absolutely did not refuse to serve as the rope holder when it was your turn. The buddy system only worked if everyone participated. There was also an unspoken hierarchy about timing and positioning. The captain or chieftain usually had first access to the preferred spot, which was typically the stern downwind of the rest of the crew. Experienced sailors followed, then the newer hands. This wasn't rigid. Nobody was going to force a rookie to soil himself waiting for his turn, but there was an understood order of priority that helped prevent conflicts on a ship where conflict could quickly become deadly. The stern position was coveted for practical reasons. Wind generally blew from the bow toward the stern, or at an angle across the beam, which meant that anything done at the stern was carried away from the ship rather than back onto it. Doing your business at the bow, by contrast, risked having the wind catch the output and deposit it back on the deck, or worse, on your crewmates. This was considered extremely poor form. The phrase foul wind may or may not derive from this phenomenon, but the Vikings certainly understood the principle. Now, you might be wondering, what about night time? The sun has set, the ship is running through darkness lit only by stars and the occasional bioluminescent glow of disturbed plankton, and you wake with an urgent need. Do you really fumble your way to the rail in pitch blackness, risking a fatal tumble for the privilege of peeing into water you can't even see? The answer is usually yes. Viking sailors developed remarkable night vision through sheer necessity, and they memorized the layout of their ships so thoroughly that they could navigate it blindfolded if needed. Night watches rotated continuously, meaning there were always some men awake to assist if needed. And the risk of going to the rail in darkness, while real, was considered preferable to the alternatives. But there were limits. In truly foul weather, storms so violent that going on deck was dangerous for any reason, the bucket came out. This was a wooden container kept specifically for emergencies, positioned near the stern where the worst of the weather was least severe. It was used only when absolutely necessary, because using the bucket created problems that going to the rail did not. The bucket accumulated. That was its fundamental flaw. Every use added to its contents, and those contents did not magically disappear. They sat there, sloshing with the ship's movement, releasing odours that made the normal shipboard smells seem like perfume by comparison. In warm weather, bacterial activity accelerated. In any weather, the proximity of human waste to living space increased the risk of disease transmission. Viking crews handled this through rapid disposal and rigorous cleaning. The bucket was emptied overboard at the first possible opportunity, sometimes mid-storm if conditions allowed even briefly, always immediately afterward when the weather cleared. The empty bucket was then scrubbed with seawater and sand, the maritime equivalent of scouring, until it was as clean as a wooden container that had recently held human waste could reasonably be. It was a duty no one enjoyed, but it was a duty everyone accepted because everyone understood the consequences of neglecting it. The person responsible for bucket duty rotated, usually matching the bailing rotation, so that the same hands dealing with bilge water also dealt with the bucket. This made a certain grim sense. If you were already elbow deep in the ship's worst fluids, handling the bucket wasn't much of an additional burden. It also meant that everyone, regardless of rank, eventually took their turn with the least pleasant task on the ship. There's something almost democratic about that if you squint. The Earl's son and the newly recruited farmhand both had to scrub the bucket. The legendary warrior who'd raided a dozen monasteries and the merchant making his first trading voyage both had to deal with the physical consequences of their crewmates' digestion. It was a levelling experience, a reminder that underneath the hierarchies of status and wealth and martial reputation, everyone was just a human body with human needs. The sagas don't dwell on these details, of course. When Egil Skallagrimsson vomited on arrival in one famous passage, it was recorded because the act was deliberately insulting, part of a social conflict that made for good storytelling. The 1,000 routine trips to the rail, the endless bucket rotations, the careful choreography of bodily functions, none of that made the cut. It was too mundane, too universal, too obviously present in every listener's own experience to require documentation. But it was happening. Every voyage, every ship, every day at sea. The Vikings crossed oceans and raided empires and established trade routes spanning half the world, and they did it all while managing the relentless biological reality that humans are at the most fundamental level, tubes that convert food into waste. The system worked not because it was elegant, it wasn't, but because it was practical, adaptable, and embedded in social norms that made cooperation automatic. You settle back into your spot, the urgent pressure relieved, and watch the sun descend toward the western horizon. Ulf catches your eye and nods, a small acknowledgement that means nothing and everything. You've participated in the system, you've upheld your end of the arrangement, and tomorrow, when Ulf needs the rope, you'll be there for him. That's how you survive out here. Not through heroism or magic or the favour of the gods, though those certainly help, but through 1,000 small cooperations, a web of mutual assistance that keeps everyone alive and functional, and just clean enough to avoid catastrophe. The storm has been building for hours, the sky darkening from grey to charcoal, to something that looks less like weather and more like a bruise spreading across the heavens. The wind, which had been steady and cooperative all morning, now gusts unpredictably, catching the sail at angles that make the ship lurch and shudder. The captain has ordered the mast lowered, the sail bundled, the oars stowed. There's nothing to do now but ride it out, bail like your life depends on it because it does, and pray to whatever gods you favour. This is when the bucket system becomes not just an option but a necessity. You're huddled amidships with the rest of the crew, the lowered sail stretched overhead as a makeshift tent, its tar-treated wool keeping out the worst of the rain, while doing nothing for the spray that lashes through every gap. The ship pitches violently. Standing is impossible. Going to the rail would be suicide. The waves crashing over the gunwales are chest high, and one wrong step would sweep you into water so cold and churning that no rope could save you. And yet, biology doesn't pause for weather. The bucket sits in the corner of your improvised shelter, lashed to a cleat so it won't slide across the deck when the ship rolls. It's a sturdy wooden vessel, maybe 1.5 feet in diameter and 1 foot deep, with a rope handle for carrying and a fitted lid that does almost nothing to contain the smell, but at least prevents splashing during the worst of the motion. It's also already been used twice since the storm began, and the interior has taken on that particular aroma of confined human waste that you will never, ever forget for as long as you live. You don't have a choice. You make your way to the bucket, crawling really, because walking is out of the question, and you do what you need to do while your crewmates politely pretend to focus on something else. The lid goes back on, you crawl back to your spot, and you try very hard not to think about the fact that this is where you'll be sleeping tonight, 3 feet from a bucket of communal waste, while the North Atlantic does its level best to tear your ship apart. The Vikings called storms like this various names, depending on severity and regional dialect, but the universal experience was the same. Terror, exhaustion, and the overwhelming smell of a bucket that couldn't be emptied because emptying it would mean opening the sail tent and letting the storm inside. You endured. That was the only option. What made the bucket system survivable, barely, was the understanding that it was temporary. Storms passed, weather cleared, and the moment conditions allowed, that bucket went over the side with enough force to express exactly how everyone felt about its contents. The relief wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The bucket represented the breakdown of normal systems, the failure of the preferred approach. Getting rid of it meant things were returning to normal. The cleanup protocol was rigorous by necessity. Once the bucket was emptied, it wasn't simply set aside for the next emergency. It was scrubbed with seawater, aggressive, thorough scrubbing, the kind that left your arms aching and your hands raw. Sand was used as an abrasive, scouring the interior surfaces to remove any residue that might harbour bacteria or simply smell terrible. The bucket was then rinsed repeatedly, left to dry in whatever sun or wind was available, and finally inspected by someone with the unfortunate job of confirming it was actually clean. Historians still argue whether the Vikings understood the connection between cleanliness and disease, or whether they were simply responding to the intolerable sensory experience of a dirty bucket. The evidence suggests a combination. They didn't have germ theory, that wouldn't emerge for another millennium, but they had centuries of accumulated experience that told them dirty conditions led to sickness. The mechanism was mysterious, but the correlation was clear. Keep things clean, get sick less often. The bucket cleaning wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival. Some ships apparently carried multiple buckets, allowing for rotation during extended storms. If one bucket reached capacity, and capacity came faster than you'd hope, with 40 men sharing a single container, it could be sealed and set aside while a fresh one took its place. The full bucket would be emptied at the first possible opportunity, even if conditions were still dangerous, because the alternative was worse. The positioning of the bucket mattered too. It was kept as far from food storage as the cramped conditions allowed, usually in the stern section near where the steering oar attached. This wasn't just about distance, it was about airflow. Even under the sail tent there was some movement of air, and the stern position took advantage of whatever ventilation existed to carry odours away from the main sleeping area. There's a certain grim humour that apparently developed around bucket duty, at least according to hints in the sagas and later Scandinavian folklore. Nicknames were given to particularly unpleasant storms based on how many bucket uses they required. Jokes were told about the person whose contribution tipped the bucket over some metaphorical threshold. Complaints were lodged semi-seriously about crewmates whose dietary choices resulted in especially offensive outputs. Humour was a coping mechanism, a way of acknowledging the disgusting reality while maintaining enough psychological distance to endure it. But the humour had limits. Actually failing in bucket duty, neglecting to empty it promptly when conditions allowed, skipping the cleaning protocol, positioning it carelessly, was not a joking matter. These failures could and did lead to disease outbreaks that killed crew members. The man who couldn't be trusted with the bucket couldn't be trusted with anything, and on a ship where trust was the foundation of survival, that was a serious problem. The bucket also served purposes beyond its primary function during storms. It was the backup system for illness. If someone was too sick to make it to the rail, vomiting from food poisoning, weakened by fever, incapacitated by injury, the bucket came out regardless of weather conditions. This was actually its most common use in many voyages, not as a storm accommodation, but as a sick room fixture. Seasickness, in particular, generated bucket usage that the sagas diplomatically ignore, but that must have been constant on certain voyages. Not everyone adapted smoothly to life at sea. Some men spent their first days aboard in a continuous cycle of nausea that left them too weak to reliably make it to the rail. The bucket was there for them, positioned within arm's reach of wherever they'd collapsed, and the crew understood that this was temporary. The sickness would pass, the man would recover, and eventually he'd be strong enough to handle things properly. But not always. Some people never got their sea legs. Some people remained queasy for entire voyages, spending weeks in a state of low-grade misery that made every task harder and every smell worse. These individuals were not mocked, well, not much, and not cruelly, because seasickness was understood to be outside one's control. You didn't choose to be incapacitated by the motion of the ship. You simply were or you weren't. The bucket accommodated those who were. The storm outside is reaching its peak now, the ship groaning in ways that sound less like wood and more like something alive, something suffering. The bucket has been used 4 more times since you last looked. You've lost track of whose contributions are whose, which is probably for the best. The smell has reached a kind of saturation point where it's simply the air you're breathing, inescapable, and therefore almost ignorable. And yet you realise you're not actually sick. None of your crewmates are clutching their stomachs or showing signs of the flux. The bucket is disgusting, but it's functioning. It's containing what needs to be contained, preventing the waste from spreading across the deck, keeping the sleeping area merely unpleasant rather than genuinely hazardous. The storm will pass, it always does, and when it passes the bucket will be emptied with prejudice, scrubbed until it practically glows, and stored away until the next emergency. The system will reset. The default approach, rail, rope, buddy, will resume. And this night, this terrible bucket-necessitating night, will become a story you tell in harbours to impress people who've never seen the open ocean. For now, though, you pull your cloak tighter. Turn your face toward whatever relatively fresh air you can find and wait. The bucket sits in its corner, doing its job, quietly preventing a bad situation from becoming a catastrophic one. That's really what all of these systems come down to, not perfection, but prevention. Not comfort, but survival. The Vikings didn't eliminate the problems of waste management at sea. They managed them, contained them, prevented them from spiralling into the disease and death that could, and did, destroy less careful crews. The bucket was the backup to the backup, the emergency system that existed because emergencies were inevitable. It was never pleasant, it was never elegant, but it worked, which on the open ocean is the only standard that matters. The storm has passed, leaving behind a sea that sparkles with almost offensive cheerfulness under the returned sun, as if the night's violence was merely a bad dream that water and sky have collectively agreed to forget. Your body disagrees. Every muscle aches from bracing against the ship's motion. Your eyes are gritty from sleeplessness, and you're fairly certain you've developed a permanent twitch in your left eyelid. But you're alive. The ship is intact, and the bucket has been emptied overboard with a collective sigh of relief that needed no words. Now comes a different kind of work. The bailing. The bilge is full, fuller than you've ever seen it. The storm having driven seawater through every gap in the planking until the lowest section of the ship sloshes like a flooded basement. This is normal after heavy weather, expected and planned for, but that doesn't make the labour any less exhausting. Every hand is needed at the bailing line, a human chain passing wooden scoops and leather buckets from the bilge to the gunwale, each container heavy with water that seems determined to stay aboard. What strikes you, as you settle into the rhythm of lift pass, is the colour of what you're bailing. It's not the clear green-blue of the sea outside. It's darker, murkier, carrying suspended particles that you don't particularly want to identify. This is the bilge in its true form. Seawater plus everything else. Fish scales, food scraps, the inevitable organic matter from 40 bodies living in close quarters, waste that missed the bucket or drained from its base, all of it mixing in the ship's lowest point, creating a slurry that experienced sailors call bilge soup, with exactly the tone of voice you'd expect. And yet, as you bail this unpleasant mixture overboard, you're participating in one of the Viking longship's most important and least celebrated sanitation systems. The bilge isn't just a problem to be managed, it's a solution of sorts. A passive flushing mechanism that prevents the accumulation of dangerous waste concentrations. Here's how it works. The clinker-built hull, with its overlapping planks, is remarkably seaworthy but not watertight. Seawater seeps in constantly, slowly during calm conditions, rapidly during storms, trickling through the gaps in the caulking and collecting at the lowest point of the hull. This influx dilutes any organic matter that ends up in the bilge, waste from the bucket system, scraps from food preparation, the inevitable biological outputs of humans and animals sharing a confined space. The dilution matters enormously. Concentrated waste breeds bacteria, attracts pests, and produces the conditions for disease. But waste diluted in seawater, constantly refreshed seawater at that, loses its potency. The salt content alone has antimicrobial properties. The constant motion of the ship prevents the stagnant conditions that pathogens love, and the bailing process removes the diluted mixture entirely, exporting the problem to an ocean vast enough to process it without consequence. Historians still argue whether this was an intentional design feature or a happy accident of construction methods optimized for other purposes. The evidence suggests the latter. Viking shipwrights were trying to build fast, flexible vessels that could navigate shallow waters, not sanitation systems, but the result was the same either way. The longship's chronic leakiness, which seems like a flaw from a modern perspective, actually served a hygienic purpose. The bailing rotation was one of the most egalitarian aspects of shipboard life. Everyone participated, from the captain to the lowest-ranking crew member. There was no dignity in bailing. It was wet, smelly, back-breaking work that left you exhausted and covered in bilge residue. But there was also no shame in it. The ship floated because people bailed. Your contribution to the bailing line was as important as your contribution to the fighting line, maybe more so in purely practical terms. Specialised tools made the work slightly less miserable. The bailing scoop was a wooden implement shaped something like a deep dustpan, designed to fit into the narrow space of the bilge and hold a substantial amount of liquid. Larger ships might have multiple scoops working simultaneously, their operators developing a rhythm that moved water with surprising efficiency. Leather buckets supplemented the scoops for bulk removal, their flexible material allowing them to squeeze into spaces rigid wood couldn't reach. The bailing station was typically positioned near amidships, where the hull's curvature created the lowest point. Removable deck planks provided access to the bilge, and someone, the unlucky person at the bottom of the chain, had to actually climb down there, knee-deep in bilge soup to scoop out what gravity had collected. This was the worst position in the rotation. but it was also the most necessary. Without that person in the bilge, the scoops could only reach so far. You're not in the bilge today, thankfully. You're mid-chain, receiving containers from the person behind you and passing them forward to be dumped overboard. It's monotonous work that lets your mind wander while your arms operate on autopilot, and you find yourself watching the bilge water arc over the gunwale into the sea below. Each arc carries away waste. Each arc makes the ship a little safer, a little cleaner, a little more survivable. The Vikings didn't think of it in these terms. They thought of it as keeping the ship afloat, but the sanitation benefits were real regardless of whether anyone recognized them. There's something almost meditative about bailing once you find the rhythm. Lift, pass, lift, pass. The repetition becomes a kind of trance, your conscious mind disengaging while your body does what needs to be done. This is why Vikings often sang while bailing, the same way they sang while rowing. Work songs that set the pace and distracted from the tedium, passed down through generations of seafarers who knew that keeping morale high was as important as keeping the bilge low. The songs varied by region and crew, but they shared common themes: the sea, the wind, women waiting at home, battles fought and treasures won. Some were bawdy enough to make modern listeners blush. Some were haunting melodies that seemed to capture something essential about the loneliness of the open ocean. All of them served the same purpose: making unbearable work bearable, one verse at a time. After several hours of concerted effort, the bilge level drops to acceptable limits. Your arms feel like they might actually fall off, but there's a satisfaction in seeing the deck planks back in place over a bilge that's merely damp rather than flooded. The ship sits higher in the water, rides more responsively to the waves, feels alive again in ways it didn't when waterlogged. The bailing tools are cleaned and stowed. Yes, cleaned, because even bailing equipment needed maintenance to prevent buildup of residue, and the rotation returns to its normal schedule. Someone will check the bilge again in a few hours, then again a few hours after that, maintaining the eternal vigilance that keeps Viking ships from becoming Viking submarines. This is the hidden heroism of Norse seafaring. Not the raids that made legends, not the voyages of discovery that changed history, but the endless, unglamorous work of keeping water out and waste managed. Thousands of hours of bailing across thousands of voyages, countless arms aching with the same exhaustion you're feeling now, countless crews singing the same songs to distract themselves from the same tedium. The bilge doesn't care about your reputation. It doesn't care how many enemies you've defeated or how many silver coins you've earned. It fills regardless, demanding attention, requiring the same humble service from earl and thrall alike. In that democracy of necessity, maybe something valuable got communicated about human equality, or maybe not. Maybe it was just work that needed doing and got done. Either way, you're cleaner now than you were this morning. The ship is cleaner. The constant circulation of seawater through the hull has done its quiet work, and the storm that seemed like a catastrophe has actually served a hygienic purpose, flushing out accumulations that calmer weather would have let linger. Silver linings, you think, dumping one last scoop of bilge water into the sea. Even storms have silver linings, if you're willing to look for them in the dark, smelly corners of a Viking longship. Let's take a moment to address something you've probably been thinking since we started this journey. Weren't Vikings just dirty barbarians? Didn't they spend their time covered in blood and mud and the general filth of medieval existence? Wasn't personal hygiene basically a foreign concept to anyone living before the invention of indoor plumbing? The answer, which might surprise you, is no. Emphatically, demonstrably, archaeologically no. The dirty Viking stereotype is one of history's more persistent myths, born largely from biased medieval chroniclers who had excellent reasons to portray Norse raiders in the worst possible light. When monks whose monasteries had just been sacked wrote about Vikings, they weren't exactly motivated to produce balanced journalism. The savage Northmen, filthy and reeking, descending like animals upon civilized Christian society, that was the narrative, and it stuck. The actual archaeological evidence tells a completely different story. Dig into any significant Viking settlement, Hedeby, Birka, Jorvik, the countless smaller sites scattered across Scandinavia, and the lands they colonized, and you'll find something striking. Grooming tools. Lots of them. Combs made from antler and bone, decorated with intricate carvings that suggest they were prized possessions rather than disposable implements. Tweezers for plucking stray hairs. ear spoons for removing wax, razors and scissors for trimming beards, nail cleaners, even toothpicks. These weren't rare luxury items available only to the wealthy. They appear in graves of all social classes, from wealthy chieftains buried with ships to common farmers laid to rest with modest possessions. The ubiquity suggests that personal grooming was a cultural priority, not an individual eccentricity. Vikings, as a society, cared about how they looked and smelled. The famous passage from John of Wallingford, an English chronicler writing in the 13th century, is often cited as evidence of Viking uncleanliness. But read it carefully, and it says the opposite. John complains that Vikings were too clean, that they bathed every Saturday, combed their hair daily, and changed their clothes regularly. This excessive attention to appearance, he grumbles, made them irresistible to English women, who were presumably accustomed to less fastidious suitors. Historians still argue whether John was exaggerating for rhetorical effect or accurately describing Viking habits, but the archaeological evidence supports his complaints. Saturday was indeed bath day in Norse culture, so important that the day's name in several Scandinavian languages derives from the word for washing. This weekly bathing ritual persisted even during voyages when possible, with crews taking advantage of anchorage near freshwater sources to strip down and scrub off a week's worth of accumulated grime. Compare this to many of their medieval contemporaries. English monks, bound by religious rules that viewed excessive attention to the body as vain and potentially sinful, might bathe only a few times a year. Frankish nobility, while certainly cleaner than peasants, didn't maintain the regular bathing schedule that Vikings considered normal. The Arab traveller Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who encountered a group of Rus Vikings on the Volga River in the 10th century, was horrified by some of their hygiene practices, but his account also reveals that they washed their hands and faces every morning, more than many cultures of the period could claim. Ibn Fadlan's famous description of Vikings sharing a washing bowl, each person spitting and blowing their nose into the water before passing it to the next, has been used to paint Vikings as disgusting. But consider the context. They were washing, daily, in a period when daily washing was far from universal. The method might offend modern sensibilities, but the impulse behind it, the cultural insistence on starting each day with some form of cleanliness ritual, was actually quite advanced. On shipboard, where fresh water was precious and full baths impossible, Vikings improvised. Seawater served for basic washing, its salt content providing some antimicrobial benefit, even as it left skin feeling sticky and clothes stiff. Combs came out daily, working through hair and beards to remove tangles, debris, and, crucially, lice. The comb was such an essential item that many Vikings carried them on their person at all times, tucked into belts, or hung from neck cords alongside more obviously valuable items. The war against lice was constant and ultimately unwinnable, but Vikings fought it anyway. Lice thrived in the cramped, warm conditions of ships and longhouses, spreading easily from person to person through shared bedding and close contact. Regular combing removed adult lice and eggs, keeping populations somewhat controlled. Special fine-toothed combs, the knit combs still used today, appear in Viking Age sites, suggesting a sophisticated understanding of the louse life cycle and targeted interventions against it. Beard and hair care extended beyond mere hygiene into the realm of social signalling. A well-groomed beard announced that its owner had the time, resources and self-respect to maintain his appearance. A tangled, neglected beard suggested the opposite, someone too poor, too busy or too careless to meet basic cultural standards. This is why warriors heading into battle often took time to groom themselves. If you were going to die, you wanted to die looking good. If you survived, you wanted to impress enemies and allies alike with your composure. Clothing hygiene presented its own challenges, which we'll explore in more detail later. But even here, Vikings showed more sophistication than the barbarian stereotype suggests. Clothes were aired regularly, beaten to remove dust and debris, and washed when opportunity permitted. The wool garments that formed the bulk of Viking wardrobes had natural properties, lanolin content primarily, that resisted odor and bacteria to some degree, but this wasn't an excuse for neglect. Clean clothes were a priority, and dirty clothes were a mark of shame. The evidence extends to dental hygiene as well. Viking skeletons show surprisingly good teeth for the medieval period, with lower rates of decay than many contemporary populations. This wasn't because they avoided sugar. Their diet included honey and dried fruits that certainly caused some dental problems, but because they actively cared for their teeth. Toothpicks appear in archaeological sites. Chewing on certain herbs was common. The idea of dental care as a regular practice, rather than an emergency response to unbearable pain, was apparently part of Viking culture. Even the sagas, filtered as they are through centuries of oral transmission and later literary reworking, occasionally reveal hygiene-related details. Characters are praised for their cleanliness or mocked for their filthiness. Bathing features as a setting for important scenes. The maintenance of appearance, including grooming and washing, appears as a mark of civilization, something that separates proper Norse society from the truly barbarous. You're sitting on your rowing bench now, running a bone comb through your salt-stiffened hair, working out the tangles that accumulated during the storm. Around you, others are doing the same, a crew-wide grooming session that happens almost unconsciously whenever conditions allow. The comb is one of your most treasured possessions, its handle carved with interlacing patterns that identify it unmistakably as yours. You've had it for years. You'll probably have it for years more, unless you lose it overboard or in battle, and replacing it would be both expensive and emotionally difficult. This ritual, the daily combing, the attention to appearance even in circumstances that seem to mock such concerns, is part of what makes you Viking. Not the raiding, not the sailing, not the gods you worship or the language you speak, but the small, persistent insistence on maintaining standards of cleanliness and grooming that your Christian neighbours would consider excessive. You are, by the standards of your time, remarkably clean. Not clean by modern standards, certainly. You still smell like fish oil and sweat in the accumulated atmosphere of a ship that's been at sea for days. But you've done what you can with what you have, which is more than many people in this century would bother to attempt. The barbarian stereotype never fit. It was propaganda created by victims who needed to dehumanize their attackers, perpetuated by later scholars who couldn't imagine anything good coming from the pre-Christian North. The reality was more complex, more interesting, and more hygienic than anyone wanted to admit. The sun is directly overhead now, which means it's time for the midday meal, such as it is. Your stomach, which has been complaining quietly since dawn, suddenly becomes much more insistent as the smell of food begins to circulate through the ship. Someone is opening the stores, pulling out the day's rations, and you realise you're actually hungry enough to eat whatever emerges, regardless of how appealing or unappealing it might be. Viking diet at sea was, above all else, practical. It had to be food that could survive weeks or months without refrigeration, that could handle the constant dampness of shipboard life, that provided enough calories to fuel hard rowing while taking up minimal storage space. Freshness, variety, flavour. These were luxuries that the open ocean couldn't provide. The staple was dried fish. You've been eating it for days now, and you'll be eating it for days more, and if you're being honest, you'll probably be sick of it for years after this voyage ends. Cod, mostly. Stockfish, they call it. Dried on wooden racks until it turns into something resembling edible planks. You rehydrate it by soaking, or you gnaw on it directly if you're lazy, or if fresh water is too precious to waste on meal preparation. Either way, it provides protein and calories with remarkable shelf stability. Stockfish could last for years if stored properly, making it ideal for voyages of uncertain duration. The drying process, you should understand, wasn't just about preservation, it was about safety. Fresh fish spoils rapidly, becoming a breeding ground for bacteria that can cause anything from mild food poisoning to fatal illness. Dried fish, with its moisture removed, simply doesn't support bacterial growth. The Vikings didn't know about bacteria, but they knew that properly dried fish didn't make you sick, and that was enough. Smoked meat follows similar principles. Lamb, goat, occasionally beef or pork, hung in smokehouses until the exterior developed that characteristic dark crust that signals preservation. The smoke itself had antimicrobial properties, coating the meat with compounds that inhibited bacterial growth. Combined with salting, which drew moisture out and created conditions too hostile for most pathogens, smoking produced a protein source that could survive the voyage. You're handed your portion now, a chunk of dried cod, a strip of smoked mutton, and something that approximates bread. A hard, flat cake made from ground barley that has all the culinary appeal of a wood shingle, but provides carbohydrates your body desperately needs. There's also a small portion of skyr, that fermented dairy product that Vikings carried in leather bags, and consumed with something approaching enthusiasm. Skyr. Historians still argue whether what Vikings ate was truly the same as the modern Icelandic products sold in grocery stores, but the basic principle was similar. Milk fermented until it thickened, the fermentation process naturally preserving it, while introducing beneficial bacteria that aided digestion. Skyr provided protein, fat, and the probiotics that your gut microbiome needed to stay healthy. Though Vikings would have described the benefit simply as, it doesn't make you sick and it tastes acceptable, the fermentation is key. Fresh milk would be impossible to transport on a sea voyage. It would spoil within days, becoming not just unpalatable but dangerous. But fermented dairy, like dried fish and smoked meat, had been transformed into something stable. The fermentation process consumed the sugars that bacteria would otherwise feast upon, producing acids that created an environment hostile to dangerous pathogens. Vikings carried fermented dairy because it worked, because generations of trial and error had established its reliability. This brings us to a quirky but important point about Viking diet and waste management. What goes in affects what comes out. The dried, smoked, fermented diet of shipboard life produced waste that was, generally speaking, less problematic than the waste produced by fresh food diets. Lower moisture content meant less liquid waste. The fermented dairy contributed beneficial gut bacteria that helped process food efficiently. The relative absence of fresh vegetables, which can carry soil-borne pathogens, reduced one common source of shipboard illness. None of this was intentional. Vikings ate what they ate because it was available, storable, and filling. But the dietary choices that practicality forced upon them happened to create conditions favourable to shipboard health. It's another example of Viking success being built on systems that worked even when the people using them didn't fully understand why. You chew your dried cod, which requires significant jaw effort, and wash it down with water from the ship's supply, rationed carefully, a few mouthfuls per person per meal. The water is warm and tastes faintly of the wooden cask it's stored in, but it's still fresh, still safe, and that's what matters. We'll talk about water storage in detail soon, because it's one of the more challenging aspects of maritime sanitation. The meal is eaten in relative silence, not from any social prohibition, but simply because everyone is tired and hungry and focused on the food. Conversations will resume afterward, during the digestive lull that follows midday eating. But for now, there's just the sound of chewing and the creak of the ship and the endless rhythm of the waves. One thing you don't see on this ship is elaborate food preparation. There's no cooking happening mid-voyage. Fire on a wooden vessel surrounded by seawater is a risk no sensible captain would take under normal circumstances. The food is eaten as it comes from storage, dried, smoked, fermented, ready to consume without heat. This limitation, while culinarily depressing, has its own sanitation benefits. Cooking requires fresh water for boiling and cleaning. It produces food waste that needs disposal. It creates conditions, warmth, moisture, that bacteria love. By eliminating cooking, Vikings eliminated those problems. The exception proves the rule. On longer voyages, when circumstances permitted, ships might beach for the night and establish temporary cooking fires on shore. These were opportunities to prepare hot meals, boil water, and generally restore some culinary normalcy. They were also, not coincidentally, opportunities for more thorough waste disposal and cleaning. The two went together. Shore time meant both better food and better sanitation. Some larger ships, particularly the Nar trading vessels designed for long ocean crossings, carried simple hearth boxes, stone-lined containers that could hold a small fire without, ideally, igniting the surrounding wood. These allowed for limited cooking even at sea, primarily heating water or warming pre-prepared food rather than actual cooking from scratch. The hearth boxes were used sparingly and watched constantly, the risk of fire always present in the captain's mind. Your meal is finished now, the last crumbs of barley bread carefully retrieved from your lap, because wasting food at sea is a sin that even the gods would punish. You feel better, not full, exactly, but no longer hungry, which is the realistic standard out here. Your body has fuel for the afternoon's work, whatever that work might be. The meal scraps, minimal as they are, get collected and disposed of according to established protocol. Bone fragments and inedible portions go overboard immediately. Any food that started to spoil goes overboard with extra prejudice, lest it contaminate the remaining stores. The storage area is inspected, checked for moisture intrusion or pest activity, and sealed again until the next meal. This vigilance around food storage was critical. One spoiled batch of fish could ruin an entire supply. One rat nest in the grain could mean starvation on a long voyage. The person responsible for stores, usually someone experienced enough to recognise the early signs of spoilage, held one of the most important non-combat positions on the ship. You settle back against your sea chest, feeling the pleasant lethargy of digestion begin to spread through your body. The meal was monotonous, the same thing you've eaten for days, but it was safe. It didn't make you sick. It gave your body what it needed without introducing new risks. That's the standard for Viking shipboard cuisine. Not delicious, but survivable. Not varied, but reliable. Not fresh, but safe. And in an environment where a single bad meal could mean illness, dehydration, and death, safe was everything. Of all the resources aboard this ship, none is more precious than the water. Not the weapons, not the trade goods, not even the food. Water. You can survive weeks without food if you absolutely must. You'll be miserable and weak, but you'll survive. Without water, you have days, maybe a week in ideal conditions. Out here, surrounded by an ocean you cannot drink. Fresh water is quite literally the difference between life and death. The Vikings understood this with bone-deep certainty, and they developed storage and rationing systems that reflected water's supreme importance. The primary storage vessels were wooden casks, barrels of various sizes sealed with pitch to prevent leakage and seawater intrusion. The wood itself, usually oak or pine, was chosen for its density and resistance to rot. The barrels were positioned carefully within the ship, typically secured amidships where the motion was least violent and the risk of damage lowest. They were checked regularly for leaks, because a leaking water barrel was an emergency that could doom the entire voyage. Leather bladders provided supplementary storage, especially on smaller vessels where space was at a premium. These bladders, essentially large water skins made from treated animal hide, could be squeezed into odd corners that rigid barrels couldn't occupy. They were lighter than wood, flexible enough to deform without breaking when the ship rolled, and reasonably watertight when properly sealed. The downside was durability. Leather dried out, cracked, and eventually failed in ways that wooden barrels didn't. Some ships carried both, barrels as primary storage, bladders as backup. This redundancy was intentional. If a barrel cracked, the bladders provided a reserve. If a bladder failed, the barrels kept the voyage viable. You didn't put all your water in one container because containers failed, and failure meant death. The rationing system was strict by necessity. Water was distributed at set times, morning, midday, evening, in measured quantities that balanced immediate need against uncertain duration. You received enough to prevent dehydration, but not enough to feel comfortable. That persistent low-level thirst was simply part of shipboard life, something you learned to accept because the alternative was running out entirely. Historians still argue about exact ration quantities, since written records are scarce, and archaeological evidence can only tell us about storage capacity, not consumption patterns. Estimates suggest something like 1 to 2 litres per person per day as a baseline, increased somewhat if the voyage was expected to be short and decreased if supplies were running low. The captain made judgment calls based on remaining stock, estimated distance, and the crew's condition, decisions that could mean life or death if miscalculated. The water's quality degraded over time, which introduced its own sanitation challenges. Stored in wooden containers without modern purification, fresh water gradually developed populations of microorganisms. It turned cloudy. It acquired tastes and smells that announced its deterioration. Left long enough, it became genuinely dangerous to drink. To slow this process, Vikings employed several strategies. Adding vinegar or ale to the water in small quantities changed the pH enough to inhibit some bacterial growth. Some crews used honey, whose antimicrobial properties were known even without scientific understanding of why they worked. Others simply accepted that water quality would decline and tried to drink the oldest supplies first, while they were still relatively fresh. The separation of drinking water from contaminated bilge water was absolutely critical. The bilge, as we've discussed, contained a slurry of seawater, waste, and organic matter. Any drinking water that mixed with bilge water became instantly unusable, contaminated beyond recovery, fit only to be dumped overboard. The storage position, the sealing of containers, the constant vigilance against leaks and spills. All of this served to maintain the boundary between drinkable water and shipboard sewage. You're thirsty right now, as it happens. Not dangerously so, but that persistent background thirst that reminds you there's never quite enough to drink. The next water distribution is hours away. You could ask for an extra ration, people sometimes did when thirst became unbearable, but doing so marked you as weak, unable to handle the standard deprivation that everyone else was managing. So you don't ask. You sit with your thirst, distract yourself with work or conversation, and wait for the scheduled distribution like everyone else. It's a small discipline, but small disciplines are how you survive out here. Collecting fresh water when possible was a priority during voyages. If rain fell, actual fresh rain, not the salt-laden spray of storms, containers were set out to collect it. If the ship passed near land with visible freshwater sources, a shore party might be dispatched to refill depleted stores. These opportunities were seized eagerly, even if it meant delays or risks that would otherwise be avoided. The relationship between water and hygiene was understood, if imperfectly. You didn't wash with drinking water, that would be wasteful beyond excuse. You used seawater for washing, accepting its stickiness in exchange for preserving the precious fresh supply. The only exception was wound care, where fresh water might be used to clean serious injuries, but even then, sparingly, grudgingly, with full awareness of what was being sacrificed. Some crews apparently carried water specifically designated for medical use, stored separately from the drinking supply and reserved for emergencies. This was the Viking equivalent of a first aid reserve. Water too important to drink casually, but critical to have available if someone needed wound cleaning, or, in desperate cases, to help someone in fever drink without competing for the general supply. The quality of the water source mattered enormously. Water taken from clean mountain streams, common in Norway and Iceland, started the voyage in good condition and stayed drinkable longer. Water from lowland rivers, especially near settlements, might already contain contaminants that accelerated spoilage. Experienced captains knew their water sources and planned accordingly, choosing departure points and resupply stops based partly on the quality of available fresh water. You're watching now as the waterkeeper, a designated role on this voyage, someone trusted with the most precious cargo, inspects one of the barrels. He unstops it, sniffs the contents, tilts it slightly to check the colour and clarity. His expression reveals nothing, which probably means the water is acceptable if not pristine. If it were spoiling badly, you'd see it in his face. If it were perfect, he'd relax. The careful neutrality suggests adequate, which is the best you can hope for at this point in the voyage. The barrel is sealed again, its contents measured against the remaining voyage. Rationing might tighten in the coming days depending on wind and distance, or it might loosen if a resupply opportunity appears. The uncertainty is part of the experience, that constant calculation of resources against needs that defines long-distance sailing. You turn your attention back to the horizon, where nothing has changed. Still, the same endless grey-blue expanse you've been staring at for days. Somewhere out there is land, fresh water, relief from this perpetual thirst. You'll get there eventually if the water holds out, if the weather cooperates, if the 1,000 small systems that keep this ship functional continue to function. For now, you wait, conserve, and trust the waterkeeper's judgment. Fresh water is survival. Everything else is negotiable. The salt crusting your skin right now isn't just uncomfortable, it's actually helping keep you alive. You might not appreciate that fact, given how it makes you itch and how it's turned your hair into something resembling stiff rope, but the seawater you've been using to wash yourself has antimicrobial properties that Vikings exploited with or without understanding why they worked. Let's talk about the science, since it's fascinating even if the people benefiting from it couldn't have explained it. Salt, in concentrations found in seawater, creates an environment hostile to many bacteria through a process called osmotic stress. When bacterial cells encounter high salt conditions, water is drawn out of them through their cell membranes, essentially dehydrating them from the inside. Some bacteria can tolerate this, many can't. The result is that seawater washing eliminates or inhibits a significant portion of the microorganisms that cause skin infections, wound infections, and disease transmission. Vikings washed with seawater because it was abundant, the one resource they'd never run short of, and because fresh water was too precious to waste on hygiene. but in making this practical choice they stumbled into genuine antimicrobial benefit. The salty crust you're complaining about is actually a mild antibacterial barrier, coating your skin with residue that continues to inhibit bacterial growth even after the water evaporates. This wasn't perfect, of course. Some pathogens tolerate salt just fine. Some skin conditions are actually worsened by salt exposure. And the cumulative effect of continuous saltwater washing, dry, cracked skin that became vulnerable to infection, could create its own problems. But on balance, seawater washing was significantly better than no washing at all, which was the realistic alternative. The deck beneath your feet has been scrubbed with seawater too, a morning ritual that happens regardless of weather or circumstance. Buckets of seawater are hauled aboard, splashed across the planking, and scrubbed with stiff brushes or bundles of heather until the accumulated grime of the previous day is loosened and washed overboard. This daily scrubbing serves multiple purposes. It cleans the visible dirt, it removes organic residue that might harbour bacteria or attract pests, and it maintains the wood itself, preventing the build-up of substances that could promote rot. You've taken your turn at deck scrubbing, and you know it's harder than it looks. The scrubbing is vigorous, full-body work that leaves your arms aching and your knees raw from kneeling on wet planks. The seawater is cold, especially in morning light before the sun has warmed it, and the brush catches on irregularities in the wood, requiring you to work around obstacles rather than in smooth, efficient strokes. But the result is a ship that stays relatively clean, relatively free of the accumulated filth that plagued less careful vessels. The Vikings didn't have modern cleaning products, but they had seawater in unlimited supply, and they used it aggressively. Clothing presents a more complicated picture. Wool garments, which form the bulk of Viking wardrobes, don't respond well to saltwater washing. The salt makes them stiff, damages the fibres over time, and leaves residue that's uncomfortable against the skin. So clothes were washed with seawater only when absolutely necessary, and even then the results were less than satisfying. This is where the natural properties of wool became important, which we'll discuss more fully in the next section. But for now, understand that Vikings minimised clothes washing, partly because their garments didn't need it as often as modern synthetic fabrics would. The wool did some of the work itself. Bodies, however, got scrubbed whenever opportunity and weather permitted. A calm morning, warm enough to strip down without risking hypothermia, would see crew members taking turns at the rail, hauling up buckets of seawater and sluicing themselves down. It wasn't a bath by any meaningful standard. There was no soap, no hot water, no prolonged soaking, but it removed the worst of the accumulated sweat, oil, and grime that otherwise built up to intolerable levels. Historians still argue whether Vikings supplemented seawater washing with anything else, whether herbal additives, sand scrubbing, or other techniques enhanced the cleaning process. The evidence is fragmentary. We know that soap existed in the Viking world, made from animal fat and wood ash, but whether it was carried on ships in significant quantities is unclear. The expense and space requirements probably limited its availability to shore leave, when proper washing with soap and fresh water could happen. Sand scrubbing appears in some accounts, used as an abrasive to remove stubborn dirt or dead skin. You'd wet the sand with seawater, apply it to your skin, and scrub in circular motions until the grit had done its work. The result was raw, reddened skin that was also remarkably clean. Exfoliated, the modern spa industry would say, though Vikings would have used different terminology. The face received particular attention. Facial hygiene mattered for social reasons. Your face was what people saw, what made first impressions, what signalled health and status, but also for practical ones. Eyes, ears, nose, and mouth were all entry points for infection. Keeping them clean reduced the risk of illness that entered through these vulnerable zones. You splash seawater on your face now, rubbing it into your beard, working it around your eyes and ears. The salt stings slightly, especially around the eyes, but you've learned to work quickly and rinse thoroughly. The result is a face that feels tighter, cleaner, more awake than it did moments ago. The wash water, now cloudy with what it's removed from your skin, goes over the side. The sea accepts it without comment, diluting your personal filth into the vastness of the ocean. This is another aspect of the seawater system. It's not just washing, it's disposal. The waste generated by cleaning yourself, the dead skin cells, the oil, the accumulated dirt goes immediately into an environment that can process it harmlessly. Compare this to bathing on land, where the dirty water has to go somewhere. In medieval cities, that somewhere was often the street, or a nearby river, or a cesspool that eventually contaminated groundwater. The bathing itself might clean one person, while contributing to a larger public health problem. At sea, the disposal is immediate and consequence-free. The ocean is big enough to handle anything you can contribute. As the sun climbs higher and the morning chill gives way to something approaching warmth, you feel genuinely better. The salt on your skin is uncomfortable, sure, but you're cleaner than you were. The grime that was weighing you down, literally and psychologically, has been lifted. You're ready to face whatever the day brings. This is the rhythm of shipboard hygiene. Wash when you can, wash with what you have, accept the limitations while maximising the benefits. The seawater doesn't make you clean by modern standards, but it makes you cleaner. And out here, cleaner is enough. Let's talk about the remarkable garment you're wearing right now. That woolen tunic that's been your constant companion since you left port, sleeping in it, sweating in it, occasionally wondering if it will ever be truly clean again. Here's the surprising truth. It might be cleaning itself, at least partially, thanks to properties that Vikings exploited without fully understanding. Wool, unlike cotton or linen or the synthetic fabrics of the modern world, contains lanolin, a waxy substance secreted by sheep's skin that coats the fibres even after processing. Lanolin is naturally antimicrobial. It repels water. It resists the growth of odour-causing bacteria. In short, it does a lot of the work that you'd normally need washing to accomplish. This doesn't mean your tunic doesn't smell. It definitely smells. You can't live in a garment for weeks without it acquiring a certain character. But it smells less than you'd expect, and the smell doesn't escalate the way it would in other fabrics. Where a cotton shirt would become unbearable after a few days of continuous wear, wool maintains a kind of plateau. Unpleasant, certainly, but stable. The Vikings knew this from experience, even without understanding the chemistry involved. Wool was the fabric of choice for sailing precisely because it handled the conditions so well. It stayed warm even when wet, crucial in an environment where you were constantly getting splashed. It dried relatively quickly, and it didn't develop the aggressive funk that would make close quarters living even more unbearable than it already was. The self-cleaning properties were enhanced by exposure to sea air. Something about the salt, the wind, and the sunlight worked together to reduce odours and refresh the fabric. Vikings discovered that airing out wool garments, hanging them in the rigging during fair weather, spreading them on deck to catch the breeze, could substitute for actual washing in many cases. The technique wouldn't pass muster with modern hygiene standards, but it extended the wear life of garments in an environment where washing was difficult or impossible. You've done this yourself, on days when the weather permitted. Your spare tunic, the one you're not currently wearing, gets tied to a rope and left to flutter in the wind for hours. When you retrieve it, it feels fresher, not clean exactly, but less heavy with the accumulated atmosphere of shipboard life. The sea air has done something, even if you can't explain exactly what. Historians still argue about the extent to which Vikings deliberately cultivated these properties versus simply benefiting from them accidentally. Some evidence suggests intentional lanolin preservation, processing wool in ways that retained more of the natural coating, rather than stripping it away for a softer finish. But whether this was standard practice or regional variation remains unclear. The weave of the fabric mattered too. Tightly woven wool repelled water better than loose weaves, keeping the wearer drier in spray and rain. Some Viking garments were felted, either as primary construction or as weatherproofing applied to key areas, creating an even more water-resistant layer. The technology was sophisticated, representing centuries of accumulated knowledge about fibre processing and textile engineering. Undergarments, when worn, were typically linen, a fabric that did need regular washing but that also dried quickly and was easier to clean than wool. The linen absorbed sweat directly from the skin, sparing the outer wool layers from the worst of the body's moisture. When washing was possible, the linen got washed. The wool, ideally, didn't need it. Not everyone had the luxury of multiple layers, of course. Poorer crew members might have a single woolen tunic and nothing underneath, making do with what they had. But even in these cases, the natural properties of wool provided some protection against the worst outcomes. The fabric worked for you rather than against you. You scratch at your arm through the wool, feeling the familiar texture that's become almost invisible through constant contact. The tunic is looking rough, stained with salt residue, marked by various substances you'd rather not identify, but it's holding together. Wool is durable too, resistant to the tearing and wearing that would destroy lighter fabrics. You'll probably be buried in this tunic years from now, assuming you survive this voyage and many others after it. The psychological dimension of wool's properties shouldn't be underestimated either. Knowing that your clothing is actively working to stay wearable, rather than inevitably deteriorating into unwearable filth, provides a kind of mental comfort. You're not helpless against the decay of your possessions. The systems are on your side. This is true of so many aspects of Viking shipboard life. Small advantages that accumulated into survivable conditions, the clinker-built hull that flexed with the waves, the diet that happened to produce less problematic waste, the seawater washing that provided antimicrobial benefits, the wool garments that resisted odor and bacteria. None of these features were designed with sanitation as the primary goal, but all of them contributed to it. You straighten your tunic, smoothing the wrinkles that are really the least of its problems, and turn your attention back to the horizon. The sun has shifted enough that shadows are lengthening, the afternoon beginning its slow slide toward evening. Soon there will be another meal, another water distribution, another night of cramped sleeping and strange dreams. The tunic will be there through all of it, doing its quiet work. The smell hits you the moment you open the pouch, a sharp herbal punch that cuts through the baseline funk of the ship like a knife through fog. It's your personal supply of dried herbs, stuffed into a leather pouch and kept with your other belongings. You've been rationing it, using tiny pinches to refresh your clothing and bedding, saving it for the moments when the ship's atmosphere becomes truly unbearable. This is the Viking approach to aromatic defense. If you can't eliminate the bad smells, mask them with better ones. The specific herbs varied by region, availability and personal preference. Common choices included yarrow, whose sharp scent was believed to repel insects as well as cover odours. Meadowsweet, with its sweet, honey-like fragrance. Juniper, whose antiseptic properties went beyond mere smell. Mint, in regions where it grew. Lavender, though this was rarer and more expensive in the Norse world. Even pine needles, gathered easily anywhere conifers grew, provided a clean, sharp scent that was considered pleasant. These weren't just air fresheners. Some of these plants had genuine medicinal properties that Vikings exploited through trial and error over generations. Yarrow was used to treat wounds. Compounds in the plant do actually have antimicrobial and clotting properties. Juniper was burned as fumigation, the smoke believed to purify the air of sick-making influences. Mint settled stomachs. Meadowsweet contained salicylic acid, the compound from which aspirin was later derived, and was used to treat headaches and fever. You're rubbing a pinch of dried yarrow into the collar of your tunic now, pressing it into the wool, where it will release its scent slowly over the coming hours. The effect is immediate and almost startlingly effective. Your nose, which had adjusted to the ship's baseline smell to the point of barely registering it, suddenly wakes up to a sharp, clean counterpoint. You smell better, relatively speaking. You feel better too. The psychological lift of a pleasant scent apparently universal across centuries. Moss served multiple purposes in Viking hygiene, some of which might surprise modern listeners. Sphagnum moss, which grows abundantly in Scandinavian wetlands, was used as an absorbent material for everything from wound dressings to feminine hygiene products. The moss is naturally antimicrobial. Studies have confirmed that sphagnum moss inhibits bacterial growth, which explains why wounds dressed with it were less likely to become infected. Vikings didn't know the science, but they knew the results. On ships, moss was carried in dried form, compact and lightweight until needed. It could be moistened with seawater to clean surfaces, then disposed of overboard. It could be used to insulate areas against cold or dampness. It could be applied to minor wounds when medical treatment was needed. The versatility made it valuable out of all proportion to its apparent simplicity. Historians still argue about the extent to which Vikings understood their herbal remedies as medicine versus superstition. The honest answer is probably both. Some treatments worked for scientifically valid reasons that Vikings happened to discover through empirical observation. Others worked through placebo effect, which is still a form of working. Still others didn't work at all, but persisted because cultural momentum and confirmation bias kept them alive. The aromatic herbs used for smell management fell somewhere in this spectrum. The masking of odours was real and effective. Any antimicrobial benefits were probably minor, but not zero. The psychological benefits, feeling cleaner, fresher, more comfortable, were substantial and not to be dismissed. Some ships apparently carried communal herb supplies for general use, supplementing whatever individuals brought themselves. These were distributed as needed, perhaps during particularly trying periods when the atmospheric situation had become critical. Running out of herbs wasn't an emergency exactly, but it made an unpleasant situation worse. You've finished your application and sealed the pouch again, carefully preserving the remaining supply for future moments of olfactory desperation. The yarrow scent rises from your collar, mixing with the salt and wool and fish oil background into something that's actually almost pleasant. Almost. Around you, you can see others performing similar rituals. One man is burning a small bundle of juniper over a heated stone, letting the smoke drift through his belongings. Another is crushing dried mint between his palms and rubbing it through his beard. The ship has become momentarily a kind of floating spa, if you defined spa extremely generously and had very low standards. This is the human response to unpleasant conditions: adaptation, improvisation, the deployment of whatever tools are available to make the intolerable tolerable. Vikings crossed oceans and built empires partly because they were very, very good at this kind of creative problem solving. The herbs weren't a solution to shipboard sanitation, but they were a component, one of the many small advantages that accumulated into survival. The aroma fades gradually as the afternoon continues, absorbed by wind and diluted by the constant background smell of the ship. You'll need to reapply tomorrow probably, or the day after. The supply will run out eventually and you'll have to wait until shore leave to replenish it. For now, though, you smell like yarrow, and that's enough. The goat is staring at you with that expression goats always have, equal parts curiosity and contempt, like it's judging your life choices while also planning its next attempt to eat your belongings. It's tethered near the bow where the animal passengers are kept, and it's been bleating periodically all morning in a way that suggests it would very much like to be somewhere else. You and the goat have this in common. Animals aboard Viking ships were both a necessity and a complication. Livestock provided fresh food on long voyages: meat, milk, eventually more meat when the milk production dropped. Dogs served as hunting companions, guard animals, and general morale boosters. Ravens, in the legendary traditions at least, helped with navigation by being released to find land. Horses were sometimes transported for use on arrival. Smaller ships might carry chickens, whose eggs provided nutrition without requiring the animal's death. But every animal aboard produced waste, and that waste created problems the human waste systems couldn't entirely solve. The goat you're watching produces several pounds of droppings daily, pellet-shaped presents that scatter wherever the animal moves. Unlike human waste, which could be directed over the rail or into the bucket, goat waste just happens. The tethering limits the spread, creating a designated zone of contamination around the animal, but within that zone the accumulation is constant. The solution, such as it was, involved regular cleanup and fresh bedding. Straw or hay, carried partly for animal feed and partly for this purpose, then was spread in the livestock area to absorb moisture and provide a barrier between hooves and deck. This bedding was replaced frequently, daily during long voyages, the soiled material bundled and thrown overboard while fresh stuff was distributed. It was disgusting work. You've done it once already this voyage, and you're hoping your rotation doesn't come up again soon. The smell is remarkable, even by shipboard standards. The texture of the soiled bedding, squishing between your hands as you gather it up, haunts your dreams, and the goat, throughout the entire process, continues to stare at you with that expression of bovid superiority. Historians still argue about how frequently livestock accompanied Viking voyages versus being picked up at intermediate stops. The evidence suggests that shorter raids rarely carried animals. Why bother, when you'd be home or restocked within days? But the longer colonization voyages, the journeys to Iceland and Greenland and beyond, almost certainly included livestock as founding populations for the new settlements. These voyages might last weeks or months, during which the animals needed to be kept alive and their waste managed. Dogs presented different challenges. A well-trained dog could be taught to use a specific area of the deck, similar to the human system, minimizing the spread of waste. But well-trained was relative, and not every dog aboard was particularly obedient. The sagas mention hunting dogs accompanying warriors on raids, suggesting that canine companions were valued enough to put up with the additional hygiene complications. Dog waste, at least, was smaller in volume than livestock waste, and dogs could often be encouraged to do their business over the side with patient training. The buddy system that humans used didn't apply. No one was tying a rope around their dog, but the basic principle of directing waste overboard could be taught. Birds were less problematic, their droppings minimal and easily washed away with seawater. The legendary ravens of Norse navigation, if they existed as actual practice rather than just saga embellishment, would have required negligible waste management. Even chickens, which produce notable amounts of droppings for their size, were manageable compared to larger livestock. Horses were the worst. A full-sized horse produces approximately 50 pounds of manure daily, requiring constant cleanup that could exhaust a small crew. Fortunately, horses were rarely transported on typical longships. The vessels simply couldn't accommodate them comfortably. When horses did travel by sea, they went on larger, specially designed ships with more space and more hands to handle the consequences. The animal area on your ship has become, by this point in the voyage, a zone to be avoided when possible. The smell is concentrated there, the deck perpetually damp despite cleaning efforts, the atmosphere several degrees worse than even the main crew spaces. You've learned to sit upwind of it, to breathe through your mouth when passing, to complete any necessary animal care duties as quickly as possible before retreating to relatively fresher air. The goat bleats again, and you wonder, not for the first time, whether the fresh milk and eventual meat are really worth the sanitation burden. They must be, you suppose. Generations of Vikings made this calculation and decided that animals aboard were worthwhile. But those generations weren't currently downwind of this particular goat. Fresh food was the key justification. Dried and smoked provisions lasted longer, but they couldn't match the nutritional value of fresh meat or the psychological lift of a meal that wasn't yet another portion of stockfish. Slaughtering an animal mid-voyage provided both nutrition and morale, a break in the monotony that reminded everyone they were still alive and capable of eating something that hadn't been dried for months. The slaughtering itself, when it happened, was another sanitation event. Blood and offal had to be managed, typically thrown overboard immediately rather than allowed to contaminate the deck. The butchering happened in the livestock area, keeping the mess contained, and the area received extra thorough cleaning afterward. Whatever spiritual significance the killing might have carried, these were people who took religious observances seriously. The practical aftermath was handled with the efficiency of long experience. You're still watching the goat when the call comes for afternoon duties, dragging your attention away from the animal and back to the human concerns of sailing. The goat watches you go, chewing something it probably shouldn't have gotten hold of, entirely indifferent to your departure. Animals aboard, a necessity and a complication, part of the system that keeps Vikings alive and functional across impossible distances, even when they smell terrible. The coastline appears so gradually that at first you think you're imagining it. A smudge on the horizon that could be cloud, could be fog, could be wishful thinking. But it sharpens as the hours pass, resolving into the unmistakable silhouette of land, cliffs, a beach, the dark green of vegetation. The ship is heading toward it, the captain having altered course with the deliberate confidence of someone who knew exactly where he was going all along. This is shore leave. This is the weekly reset button that makes extended voyaging possible. You can feel the anticipation rippling through the crew, a collective lightening of mood that has nothing to do with the weather and everything to do with what's coming. Shore leave means fresh water, actual bathing, fire-cooked food, solid ground beneath your feet. It means leaving behind, at least temporarily, the accumulated filth and discomfort of days at sea. It means, for the first time in what feels like forever, something approaching actual cleanliness. The Vikings planned their voyages around these coastal stops with careful intentionality. The routes they chose weren't necessarily the most direct paths between points. They were paths that provided regular access to shoreline resupply. The crossing from Norway to Iceland, for instance, could be made open ocean in favourable conditions, but prudent captains often took the longer route via the Faroe Islands, breaking the journey into manageable segments with shore access between them. Each stop served multiple purposes. Fresh water was the priority, the casks were running low, the remaining supply increasingly questionable, and nothing could continue without resupply. But alongside water came everything else: firewood for cooking, fresh game if hunting was possible, wild plants to supplement the preserved diet, and most importantly for our purposes, the opportunity for comprehensive cleaning. The ship is beaching now, the shallow draft allowing it to run right up onto the sand until the keel grounds and the vessel comes to rest at an angle. You're over the side immediately, not waiting for formal dismissal, your feet touching solid earth for the first time in days. The sensation is strange. The ground doesn't move, doesn't pitch, and your body, accustomed to constant adjustment, keeps trying to compensate for motion that isn't there. Around you, the crew is fanning out with practiced efficiency. Some are heading for the freshwater stream visible a few hundred yards inland. That's where the water-gathering parties will work. Others are collecting driftwood and fallen branches for fires. Still others are establishing a temporary camp, clearing space, setting up whatever minimal shelter the stop requires. And you, along with several crewmates, are stripping down. The bathing ritual is one of the great reliefs of Viking voyaging, the periodic full reset that makes everything else bearable. You wade into the stream, cold, achingly cold, but you barely notice, and begin scrubbing. Not with seawater this time, but with actual fresh water. Not with your hands alone, but with the rough cloth, with the soap that someone produced from the supplies, with the determined vigour of someone who has been waiting for this moment for far too long. The water around you turns grey, then brown, then slowly clears as the accumulated grime washes downstream. You can feel layers coming off. Salt residue, dead skin, oil, the indefinable coating that builds up when you can't properly wash. The sensation is borderline euphoric. You're becoming incrementally, and then all at once, clean. Historians still argue about the significance of the Saturday bathing tradition in Viking culture, whether it was religious in origin, practical, or some combination. What's clear is that weekly bathing was a cultural expectation, and shore leave was when that expectation got fulfilled during voyages. The Saturday timing might slip depending on when landfall happened, but the principle remained. Regular, thorough bathing was non-negotiable. The soap being passed around is a precious commodity, made from animal fat and wood ash in a process that produced a soft, somewhat caustic substance that nonetheless cleaned effectively. It stings in the small cuts and abrasions that shipboard life has accumulated on your hands and arms, but the sting is welcome. It means the soap is working, doing its job, killing whatever needed killing. Hair and beards receive particular attention. The combs come out, working through tangles that days of salt and wind have created. You've been combing daily, of course, but daily dry combing can't match what's possible with wet hair and soap. Lice that survived the routine maintenance get caught now, removed, crushed between fingernails with satisfying finality. Your scalp, liberated from its coating of oil and salt, practically sings with relief. The clothes are being washed too, by those who have spare garments to change into. The wool tunics get scrubbed with fresh water, not ideal for the fabric, but necessary after extended wear, then spread on rocks to dry in whatever sun is available. The linen undergarments, if you have them, get particular attention, the fabric that's been closest to your skin finally getting the thorough cleaning it's needed. The ship itself receives attention during these stops. The deck gets scrubbed with fresh water, a more thorough cleaning than the daily seawater wash. The bilge gets baled completely dry, then rinsed with fresh water to dilute the accumulated salts and organic matter. Storage areas are inspected, aired out, restocked. The ship emerges from these stops noticeably cleaner, the accumulated atmosphere of days at sea replaced by something approaching freshness. Waste disposal happens too, though it's barely worth mentioning. The land has infinite capacity for human waste, unlike the ship. You simply walk a reasonable distance from the water supply, do what you need to do, and return. No rails, no ropes, no buckets, just the normal, unremarkable process of land-based waste management that seems almost luxuriously simple after days of shipboard complications. The stop will last several hours, maybe overnight if conditions warrant. By the time you return to the ship, you'll be cleaner than you've been in days, wearing freshly washed clothes, your hair combed and your body scrubbed. The water casks will be full, the food supplies will be restocked, the ship will be refreshed, and then you'll push off again, back into the cycle of gradual accumulation that makes the next shore leave necessary. This is the rhythm: deterioration at sea, restoration on land, deterioration again, restoration again. The Vikings made it work by understanding both halves of the cycle, by accepting the deterioration as temporary and planning for the restoration as essential. You're sitting on a warm rock now, letting the sun dry your skin, watching your crewmates at their own various stages of cleaning and restoration. The goat is ashore too, tethered to a stake and enthusiastically eating vegetation it hasn't had access to for days. Everyone and everything is taking advantage of this opportunity, storing up cleanliness against the voyage to come. The water feels incredible on your clean skin. The air smells like nothing in particular, which is itself remarkable after the ship's constant olfactory presence. You could almost fall asleep here, lulled by warmth and relief and the simple pleasure of being clean. But there's work to do, supplies to gather, a schedule to keep. Shore leave is precious, and precious things don't last. You stand, stretch, and head back to join the labour. Clean enough for now, ready for what's next. You're back aboard now, the shore leave fading into memory as the ship pushes off and the coastline shrinks behind you. The clean feeling persists. You're still fresh from the bathing, still wearing laundered clothes, still operating at something close to peak hygiene by shipboard standards. It won't last, you know that. By tomorrow you'll be sliding back toward the baseline of accumulated grime that defines life at sea. But for now, you're as clean as you're going to get. This seems like a good moment to talk about hierarchy. Specifically, the hierarchy of shipboard sanitation and how rank intersected with the dirty work of keeping everyone alive and functional. The captain, or chieftain, occupied the most privileged position in almost every aspect of shipboard life. He had the best sleeping spot, typically at the stern, where the motion was least violent, and the steering oar provided a psychological barrier between him and the crew. He had first access to food and water during distributions, and yes, he had priority access to the preferred waste disposal locations. But here's what might surprise you. The captain also participated in sanitation duties. The evidence from sagas, later Scandinavian maritime traditions, and comparative analysis with other seafaring cultures suggests that while privilege existed, it wasn't absolute. A captain who refused to bail during emergencies, who exempted himself from the basic maintenance that kept the ship functional, would lose the respect of his crew, and in Viking society, a leader's authority rested heavily on earned respect rather than inherited position. Historians still argue about exactly how egalitarian Viking shipboard society really was. Some interpretations emphasize the democratic elements, the thing assemblies where decisions were debated, the rotation of duties, the sense of shared enterprise that characterized Norse expeditions. Other interpretations point to the very real hierarchies of wealth, birth, and martial reputation that shaped who gave orders and who followed them. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Viking ships were hierarchical spaces with acknowledged leaders and followers, but they were also spaces where survival depended on collective effort. You couldn't maintain rigid class distinctions when everyone needed to bail or everyone drowned. The practical demands of maritime life created a functional egalitarianism that coexisted with social stratification. The bucket duty we discussed earlier was an example of this balance. Everyone took their turn, from the earl's son to the newly recruited farmhand. The bucket didn't care about your ancestry or your wealth, or how many enemies you'd killed. It needed to be emptied and cleaned, and whoever was next in the rotation did the work. But the rotation itself wasn't random. Newer crew members, lower status individuals, and those who had committed minor social offences found themselves doing bucket duty more frequently than their privileged counterparts. The work was distributed, but it wasn't distributed equally. Hierarchy asserted itself in the scheduling even as the duty itself was shared. Similarly with bailing, everyone bailed, but some people spent more time in the bilge, that worst position, knee-deep in slurry, than others. Preference was given to the experienced, the high status, the favoured. These individuals still bailed, still contributed to the collective work, but they contributed from more comfortable positions in the chain. The waste disposal hierarchy at the rail followed similar patterns. The stern position, downwind of the crew, was the captain's by right and available to others by his implicit or explicit permission. Lower status crew members used positions further forward, where wind conditions might be less favourable. This wasn't written into any formal code, but everyone understood it, the same way everyone understood 1,000 other unwritten rules of shipboard social order. What made this system work, rather than generating resentment and conflict, was the shared understanding that the hierarchy served collective survival. The captain's privileges were balanced by the captain's responsibilities. The lower status crew members' extra bucket duties were balanced by the protection and leadership the captain provided. It wasn't fair exactly, but it was functional, a social contract that kept the ship operating smoothly. The democratic elements emerged most strongly in crisis situations. During storms, when all hands were needed and survival was genuinely uncertain, hierarchy mattered less. The captain bailed alongside everyone else, the distinctions of rank temporarily suspended by immediate necessity. These moments of shared danger and shared labour reinforced the sense of collective enterprise that held the crew together. The assignment of sanitation duties also served as a form of social discipline. Minor offences, showing disrespect, shirking work, violating unwritten norms of shipboard behaviour, could be punished through extra bucket rotation or extended bilge duty. This wasn't formal law, it was social enforcement, the crew collectively signalling displeasure through the assignment of unpleasant tasks. More serious offences might result in more serious consequences, but the graduated nature of sanitation-based discipline provided a range of responses that didn't immediately escalate to violence or formal exclusion. You could express displeasure with someone's behaviour by giving them the worst jobs without having to make it a confrontation. You're watching this system in action right now, as it happens. The crew member who was caught sleeping during his watch last night has been conspicuously absent from the preferred work assignments today, instead finding himself tasked with the less pleasant duties that no one volunteers for. No one has said anything explicit, no formal punishment has been announced, but everyone understands what's happening and why. This is governance without government, order without law, the organic social structures that emerge when small groups of people are forced into close quarters with shared survival stakes. It's remarkably sophisticated in its way. The Vikings didn't need written regulations about who cleaned what and when. They developed cultural norms that accomplished the same purposes with greater flexibility. The hierarchy wasn't rigid enough to be tyrannical, not flexible enough to be chaotic. It found a balance that allowed for both structure and adaptation, both privilege and shared responsibility. And at the centre of it all, holding the system together, was the constant reality of sanitation work that had to be done by someone one way or another, if anyone was going to survive. The first sign of trouble is the sound, a wet, wretched coughing coming from somewhere forward, the kind of cough that announces misery and possibly worse. You can't see who's making it from your position, but you can hear others shifting, moving slightly away from the source of the sound. On a ship this size, disease is everyone's business. The man is revealed as the crowd parts. Eric, one of the younger crew members, hunched over his sea chest with a pallor that speaks of something more serious than seasickness. He's been declining for a day or two now. You noticed he wasn't eating much at the last meal, that his movements had become slow and uncertain, but this coughing is new, and it's alarming. The captain approaches, studies Eric for a long moment, then begins issuing quiet orders. What happens next is a crash course in Viking epidemic containment. Eric is moved. Not gently, there's no time for gentleness when contagion might be spreading, but with a kind of efficient firmness that gets him from his spot among the crew to an isolated position near the bow. His sea chest comes with him. His belongings come with him. His portion of the ship becomes effectively a quarantine zone. Quarantine is too formal a word, really. The Vikings didn't have the concept as a medical theory, but they had the practice. Sick people made other people sick. Therefore, sick people should be separated from healthy people. The logic was simple enough that it didn't require explanation. Historians still argue about how sophisticated Viking understanding of disease transmission actually was. They clearly understood that proximity mattered. Being near sick people was dangerous in ways that being far from them wasn't. But whether they conceptualized this as something passing through the air, through touch, through shared food and water, remains unclear. The mechanism was mysterious. The correlation was observable. Eric's quarantine zone is marked by his belongings and, more importantly, by the social understanding that healthy crew members should minimize contact with him. Someone will bring him food and water, delivered, not shared, and someone will check on his condition periodically. But the casual contact of normal shipboard life is suspended for him now. The bucket moves to his location. This isn't just for his convenience, it's for everyone else's protection. If Eric can't make it to the rail, and he probably can't given how weak he looks, his waste needs to be contained in his area rather than contaminating the common spaces. The bucket becomes part of the quarantine infrastructure. You're watching from a distance, as is everyone else. There's no panic exactly, but there's a heightened awareness, a vigilance that wasn't present yesterday. Everyone is suddenly very conscious of their own health, interpreting every minor sensation as a potential symptom. Is that tickle in your throat the beginning of whatever Eric has? Is that heaviness in your limbs the first sign of decline? You're probably fine. You feel fine. But the proximity of real illness makes imaginary illness feel very close. The food and water Eric receives are served in dedicated containers that won't be shared with the healthy crew. After he uses them, they're washed with seawater, scrubbed harder than usual, with that extra vigour that comes from genuine fear. The person doing the washing takes care not to touch the interior surfaces, keeping what distance he can while still accomplishing the task. These precautions might seem obvious to modern listeners raised on germ theory and public health education, but remember, these people don't know about bacteria or viruses. They don't understand the mechanisms of disease transmission. They're operating purely on observed patterns, on the accumulated wisdom of generations who noticed that certain practices reduced the spread of illness. The ruthless version of quarantine, the truly effective version, would involve putting Eric off the ship entirely, leaving him on the next bit of land they encountered, with supplies if they were feeling generous, to either recover or die without risking the rest of the crew. This happened. The sagas don't dwell on it, but the practical logic is inescapable. A single sick person could infect an entire crew, and sometimes the calculations of collective survival demanded individual sacrifice. But this isn't happening to Eric, at least not yet. His illness isn't severe enough. The captain's judgment apparently weighing the risks and deciding that containment aboard is still viable. The quarantine continues. The crew watches and waits, and Eric coughs into his arm in his isolated corner of the bow. The psychological burden of this situation falls heavily on everyone. Eric is scared and lonely, separated from his companions at exactly the moment when companionship would be most comforting. The healthy crew is scared and watchful, going about their duties with one eye always on the quarantine zone and one ear always listening for changes in the coughing. The captain is making decisions with incomplete information, balancing compassion against caution against the practical demands of the voyage. Days pass. Eric doesn't get worse, which is the first encouraging sign. The coughing persists but doesn't intensify. His appetite returns tentatively at first, then more robustly. Colour comes back to his face. The watchful tension that had gripped the crew begins, slowly, to ease. After a week, the captain makes the call. Eric is recovered enough to rejoin the crew. He emerges from his quarantine zone looking thinner, weaker, but unmistakably alive. The crew greets him with a reserve that's not quite warmth. Everyone is still a little uncertain, still a little afraid. But that will fade as the days prove that the danger has passed. His spot near the bow gets scrubbed with particular attention. The bucket that served his quarantine gets the most thorough cleaning of its life. The blankets he slept in get aired and beaten and spread in the sun to kill whatever might be lingering in the fabric. Life returns to normal, or what passes for normal on a Viking longship. Eric takes up his oar again, bails his share, makes his trips to the rail like everyone else. The illness becomes a story he'll tell in harbours eventually. The time he almost died at sea and had to spend a week in quarantine because everyone was afraid to touch him. But you remember the coughing. You remember the fear. You remember how quickly the ship transformed from a shared community to a divided one, healthy and sick separated by invisible boundaries of contagion. The systems worked. The quarantine contained whatever Eric had. The crew survived. This time. Fire is the enemy of wooden ships, and yet fire is also one of the most important tools Vikings had for maintaining sanitation at sea. The contradiction sits at the heart of shipboard life. You need fire for cooking, for warmth, for light, for fumigation, but fire, uncontrolled, will turn your ship into a floating pyre within minutes. The solution was control, careful and constant control, turning fire from a wild danger into a managed tool. The hearth box, when ships carried one, was a marvel of practical engineering. Picture a low stone-lined container, perhaps 2 feet square and 6 inches deep, filled with sand and then rocks that could hold and radiate heat. On top of this foundation, a small fire could be maintained for cooking, the stone and sand containing the flame and insulating the wooden deck beneath from the heat that would otherwise ignite it. Not all ships had hearth boxes. They were more common on Nar trading vessels designed for long oceanic crossings than on sleek longships built for speed and raiding. The weight of the stones, the space the hearth occupied, the complexity of maintaining fire at sea, these were trade-offs that different captains evaluated differently. Some decided the benefits were worth the costs, others made do without. When fire was available, it served sanitation purposes that went far beyond cooking. Smoke fumigation was a known practice, used to drive insects from enclosed spaces and, it was believed, to purify air of sick-making influences. The sharp smell of burning juniper or pine branches, wafted through the ship during periods of calm weather, was thought to cleanse the atmosphere of whatever pestilence might be accumulating. Historians still argue about the effectiveness of fumigation as the Vikings practiced it. Modern science offers partial vindication. Smoke does contain compounds with antimicrobial and insecticidal properties, and fumigation can reduce populations of certain pests and pathogens. But the effect was probably marginal compared to the psychological benefit, the sense of doing something, of actively combating the invisible threats that could kill more surely than any enemy sword. Fire also provided the only reliable method of sterilization available to Vikings. Heating water to boiling, passing metal implements through flame, burning contaminated materials, these were the options when something needed to be truly clean rather than merely less dirty. Wound treatment, when possible, involved fire, cauterizing injuries to prevent infection, heating knives that would be used for surgery, boiling the water used to clean serious wounds. The fire tending was its own specialized duty, requiring constant vigilance and expertise that not every crew member possessed. The firekeeper had to maintain the flame without letting it grow too large, feed it without creating sparks that might catch the surrounding ship, bank it during rough weather, and resurrect it when conditions allowed. A moment's inattention could mean disaster. Watch fires were sometimes maintained through the night, tiny flickering lights that provided both practical warmth and psychological comfort during the long, dark hours. These were the smallest possible fires, barely more than embers, producing just enough heat to warm hands and just enough light to see by. They required the most delicate touch, the most careful balance between function and danger. The smoking of food, when possible, extended preservation and provided variety in diet. Fish caught during the voyage could be processed into something resembling the familiar smoked product, rather than being consumed raw or simply salted. This wasn't true smoking. You couldn't replicate the extended smoking process of land-based preservation, but even a brief exposure to smoke improved flavour and added some preservative effect. You're watching the firekeeper now, crouched over the hearthbox with the focused attention that his role requires. He's adding fuel carefully, small pieces of driftwood collected during the last shore leave, each one positioned to maintain the flame without creating the sudden flare that could jump to the sail or rigging. His movements are unhurried but precise, the result of long experience with the most dangerous tool on the ship. The smell of cooking begins to spread. A fish, probably. Being prepared for the captain's meal or perhaps for a sick crew member who needs something gentler than the dried provisions. It's a rare smell at sea, this smell of hot food, and you find yourself salivating despite having eaten adequately already. The psychological power of cooked food, the comfort it provides, is out of all proportion to any nutritional advantage. Later, when the cooking is done, the firekeeper will add branches of juniper to the coals, letting the aromatic smoke drift through the ship. It's a small ritual repeated whenever conditions permit, and whether or not it actually prevents disease, it makes everyone feel like they're doing something to stay healthy. In an environment where so much is out of your control, these small rituals of agency matter enormously. Fire as tool. Fire as weapon against invisible enemies. Fire as comfort and civilization in a world that otherwise runs on salt water and muscle power. The contradiction never resolves, the danger never disappears, but the benefits, carefully managed, make the risk worthwhile. Nobody wants to talk about what happens when someone dies on a voyage. It's a possibility that everyone acknowledges privately and ignores publicly, a dark corner of the experience that decent people don't dwell on. But death at sea happened, to illness, to accident, to the 1,000 ways the ocean could kill a careful person, and the living had to deal with the consequences. This is the grim but necessary reality of maritime mortality. The first concern after the immediate grief and shock was practical. What to do with the body? A corpse on a ship presented sanitation challenges that couldn't be ignored. Decomposition would begin within hours, especially in warm weather. The smell would become unbearable, then dangerous. The body would attract whatever insects and pests existed aboard. And on a spiritual level that Vikings took very seriously, the deceased deserved a proper send-off rather than becoming a source of contamination. Burial at sea was the usual solution. The body was prepared, washed if possible, wrapped in cloth or weighted with stones, and committed to the ocean with whatever ritual the situation allowed. The sagas describe elaborate funeral ceremonies on land, with ship burials and grave goods and all the pomp appropriate to important individuals. At sea, the ceremonies were necessarily abbreviated, but the essential elements were preserved, words spoken, gods invoked, the deceased's reputation honoured before the body disappeared beneath the waves. The speed of this process was dictated by practical necessity. You couldn't keep a body aboard for long, not without consequences that would endanger the living. The preparation and ceremony might happen within hours of death, the urgency of sanitation overriding any desire for prolonged mourning. Grieve later, bury now. That was the calculus of survival. Historians still argue about the specific procedures of Viking sea burial, since the sagas focus almost exclusively on land-based funerals, and archaeological evidence from shipwrecks tells us about cargo, not customs. What we know comes largely from inference and comparative analysis with later Scandinavian maritime traditions that likely preserved older practices. The deceased's belongings presented their own considerations. Some items might be buried with the person, weapons, personal treasures, things deemed necessary for the afterlife. Other items might be claimed by surviving crew members or held for the deceased's family. The sea chest that had marked the person's space aboard ship would need to be emptied and repurposed, its contents distributed according to whatever norms applied. And then, perhaps most difficult, the space itself needed to be cleaned and reoccupied. Someone would move into the spot where the deceased had slept and worked. Life would continue, the crew necessarily filling the gap left by death. The cleaning of a death space was particularly thorough. Any fluids that had been released during dying, and dying could be a messy process, needed to be scrubbed away. The bedding was often disposed of entirely rather than washed and reused. The deck beneath was cleaned with seawater and sand, then perhaps fumigated with smoke to purify whatever lingering influences might remain. This wasn't just hygiene, it was ritual. The Norsemen believed in spirits, in influences that persisted after death, in the importance of properly sending the deceased on their journey. A space that hadn't been properly cleansed might retain something of its former occupant, not necessarily dangerous, but unsettling, wrong. The cleaning served both practical and spiritual purposes. You haven't witnessed a death on this voyage, thankfully, but you've seen the aftermath of one on a previous journey. The subdued mood that settled over the crew lasting for days, the way people avoided the space where the deceased had been, even after it was cleaned and reoccupied. The quiet conversations about mortality that happened in corners, admitting fears that normal bravado didn't allow. Death at sea was lonely in ways that land death wasn't. There was no grave to visit, no marker to remember. The ocean claimed everything, body, blood, whatever else remained, and left nothing behind. The deceased's family, if they ever learned what happened, would have no location to mourn at, no physical place to connect with their loss. But for the living, the ocean's claim was also a kind of mercy. The body was gone, completely gone, removed from the environment of the living before it could become a source of danger. The sea burial wasn't just disposal, it was protection, the vast ocean taking on the burden that the small ship couldn't manage. The Vikings sailed on. That was always the end of the story, one way or another. Someone died, the body was committed to the deep, and the voyage continued. The work needed doing, the destination still called, and the dead had to be left behind so the living could carry on. It's a harsh practicality, but it's also a kind of acceptance, an acknowledgement that death was part of a life, that voyages claimed victims, and that the living had responsibilities that outlasted grief. The ship moves beneath you, indifferent to human concerns of mortality and memory. The ocean stretches in every direction, hiding whatever it has claimed in depths that will never be seen again. Life continues. That's what the living do. let's address something that the sagas rarely mention, but that must have been a significant aspect of shipboard life: the presence of women on Viking voyages and the sanitation adaptations their biology required. Women sailed. The archaeological and historical evidence is clear on this point, even if the saga literature focuses predominantly on male warriors and their exploits. Colonization voyages to Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands included entire families. Trade expeditions sometimes brought female merchants or the wives of traders, and while raiding parties were predominantly male, even there, exceptions existed. Female biology introduces considerations that male-dominated historical narratives often overlook. Menstruation, specifically, required management in an environment where privacy was non-existent and resources were limited. How did Viking women handle this most basic aspect of their reproductive health, while living on an open-decked ship surrounded by dozens of other people? The honest answer is that we don't know for certain. Written sources from the Viking Age were produced almost exclusively by men who had little interest in documenting feminine hygiene practices. Archaeological evidence is limited. Organic materials like the cloths used for menstrual management rarely survive in the archaeological record. What we have is inference, comparative analysis, and educated speculation. Moss, which we discussed earlier as a general-purpose absorbent material, was almost certainly used. Sphagnum moss in particular had properties ideal for menstrual management: highly absorbent, naturally antimicrobial, readily available in Scandinavian wetlands, and easily disposed of by throwing overboard when soiled. The same material that dressed wounds and filled gaps in clothing could serve menstrual purposes. Cloths made from wool or linen provided another option: reusable materials that could be washed between uses, though washing would be challenging at sea. These cloths might be worn as a kind of primitive pad, held in place by undergarments or belts designed for the purpose. After use, they could be rinsed in seawater. Not ideal, but better than nothing, and dried for reuse. Historians still argue about the degree to which menstruation was considered taboo or shameful in Viking society. The evidence is mixed. Some sources suggest restrictions on menstruating women, limits on what they could touch, where they could go, while others imply a more pragmatic acceptance of biology as biology. Shipboard life, with its inescapable intimacy, may have forced a more practical approach than land-based society allowed. Privacy for waste disposal was even more limited for women than for men. The buddy system at the rail worked for anyone who could safely balance over the gunwale. But the anatomical differences meant women needed slightly more time and slightly different positioning. Some ships may have included simple modifications: a plank with a hole, as mentioned earlier, or a designated area with slightly more screening, but the evidence is speculative. What seems clear is that women who sailed on Viking ships were expected to manage their needs within the same basic framework as men, with whatever minor adaptations practicality demanded. They used the same bucket during storms, contributed to the same cleaning rotations, and dealt with the same environmental challenges. Their biology added complications, but not complications so severe that they prevented women from voyaging. The presence of families on colonization voyages suggests that these adaptations were successful. Women travelled weeks or months across open ocean, experienced all the same conditions as their male counterparts, and arrived at their destinations healthy enough to establish new settlements. Whatever they were doing for menstrual management and general hygiene, it worked. Pregnancy introduced additional considerations, though pregnant women probably avoided the most dangerous voyages if they had any choice in the matter. But pregnancy happened. Conception during long journeys, unexpected pregnancies discovered after departure, and the ship had to accommodate whatever arose. Childbirth at sea must have occurred occasionally, though I haven't found specific accounts of it. The conditions for delivery would have been terrible. No privacy, no medical facilities, limited clean water, constant motion that would make any position uncomfortable. But babies were born in far worse conditions throughout history, and some Viking infants presumably took their first breaths with the ocean rocking beneath them. The egalitarian aspects of Norse sanitation, the shared work, the rotating duties, the collective responsibility for keeping the ship habitable, applied to women as fully as to men. A woman aboard a Viking ship wasn't a passenger. She was a crew member, with expectations and responsibilities that matched her capabilities. She bailed when bailing was needed. She cleaned when cleaning was needed. She did her part because everyone had to do their part for any of them to survive. This is one of the aspects of Viking culture that sometimes gets lost in the popular image of horn-helmeted warriors. The Norse world had its restrictions and hierarchies, its limitations on what women could do and be. But it also had a practical streak that recognised ability where it existed, that valued contribution over categorical exclusion, that understood survival required all available hands. The women who sailed were survivors. They managed biology in conditions that modern hygiene standards would call impossible. They maintained themselves and often their families through voyages that tested every aspect of physical and psychological resilience. Their specific experiences, the details of how they handled the challenges unique to their biology, are largely lost to us. But their presence is documented, their success is evident, and their contributions to Norse voyaging deserve recognition. The child is crying again, that particular exhausted wail that signals hunger, discomfort, and confusion all at once. She's been at sea for 3 days now, small enough that her whole world has become this wooden vessel, and she doesn't understand why everything keeps moving, why the familiar faces of home have been replaced by these strange bearded men, why nothing smells or sounds or feels the way it should. Her mother is doing what mothers do, holding, soothing, adjusting, trying to meet needs in an environment designed for everything except infant care. The challenge is immense. The ship doesn't care about babies. The ocean doesn't pause for diaper changes. Colonization voyages to Iceland and Greenland involved entire families: men, women, children, infants, the elderly. These weren't military expeditions. They were migrations, whole communities transplanting themselves to new lands. The ships that made these crossings had to accommodate human life in all its stages, from the newborn who couldn't manage their own bodily functions to the grandparent whose needs were increasing as strength declined. Infant waste management was, frankly, its own category of challenge. Babies can't use the rail or the bucket. They can't communicate their needs clearly, can't wait for convenient moments, can't cooperate with the systems that adults had developed for adult bodies. They simply produce waste, continuously and inconveniently, and someone has to deal with it. The solutions were low-tech but effective. Swaddling cloth served as both wrapping and diaper, absorbing urine and containing solid waste until they could be changed. The soiled cloths were rinsed in seawater, better than nothing if not ideal, and dried for reuse. Babies might go through multiple cloth changes per day, each one requiring cleaning and drying in conditions that made both difficult. Moss made another appearance here, used as absorbent material inside the swaddling to increase capacity between changes. The same sphagnum moss that served wound care and menstrual management could be layered against infant skin, absorbing moisture and providing some antimicrobial protection. When saturated, the moss was disposed of overboard and replaced from the ship's stores. Historians still argue about infant mortality on Viking voyages, specifically whether the rates were significantly higher than the already high baseline infant mortality of the medieval period. The evidence is limited, but logic suggests that the combined stresses of the journey, exposure, limited fresh food, the constant motion that disrupted sleep and feeding, must have taken a toll on the most vulnerable travellers. Yet infants survived. The colonization of Iceland and Greenland succeeded, which means that enough children born in Scandinavia made the crossing alive to populate the new settlements. Whatever the mortality rates, they weren't high enough to prevent successful migration. The systems, inadequate as they might seem by modern standards, worked well enough. The mother on your ship has developed a routine, you've noticed. She changes the swaddling at roughly the same times each day, using the calm morning hours when the ship's motion is gentlest and light is good. She keeps her cleaning supplies, the spare cloths, the moss, the small container of seawater for rinsing, within easy reach of her spot. She's organised, methodical, making the best of impossible circumstances through sheer practical determination. The crew has adapted to the infant's presence too. The crying that initially drew irritated glances has become background noise, accepted as simply part of the voyage's soundscape. Someone gave up a slightly more sheltered sleeping position to the mother and child, acknowledging without discussion that the baby's needs outweighed adult comfort. The collective has accommodated its smallest member. This is the Viking approach, writ small. Practical adaptation, shared burden, the understanding that survival requires flexibility. The ideal voyage would have only healthy adults who could manage their own needs and contribute to the collective work. The real voyage had babies, and elderly and sick people and everyone in between, and somehow it all had to work anyway. Older children were easier, at least once they were past the diaper stage. A child of 3 or 4 could be taught to use the bucket, could be supervised at the rail with extra care, could understand instructions and follow rules in ways that infants couldn't. The toilet training that happened normally in home villages continued on ships if necessary. The child learning the shipboard systems alongside everything else about this strange new environment. Entertainment for children on long voyages must have been a challenge in its own right. The games, the stories, the distractions that kept small minds occupied while adults worked. These left almost no trace in the historical record, but they must have existed. Parents have always found ways to engage their children, and Viking parents would have been no exception. The elderly presented different challenges: declining mobility that made rail visits dangerous, increasing incontinence that required bucket use even in calm weather, and the general fragility that made the rigours of sea travel particularly taxing. But the elderly also brought value, experience, knowledge, social connections that gave the new settlement a foundation beyond mere physical presence. They were worth the extra burden they placed on shipboard systems. The ship you're on isn't carrying many children or elderly. It's primarily a working voyage the crew selected for capability. But you've seen the family ships during layovers, the vessels loaded with the full spectrum of human life making their way to new homes. They were chaotic, those ships, noisy and smelly and crowded with needs that couldn't be efficiently managed. They were also remarkable, proof that Vikings could transplant civilization itself across the North Atlantic, taking not just warriors but the whole society that made warriors possible. The baby has stopped crying, finally soothed into sleep by her mother's patient efforts. The ship sails on, carrying its youngest passenger toward a destination she'll never remember arriving at, a life she'll build on foundations laid by this voyage she won't consciously recall. Family voyaging, messy, complicated, essential. Let's take a step back from the specifics of Viking sanitation and consider how Norse practices compared to other seafaring cultures of the period. Were the Vikings unusually clean, unusually dirty, or somewhere in the middle of the medieval maritime spectrum? The answer might surprise you. By the standards of their time, Vikings were remarkably hygienic. Consider the Byzantine navy, operating in the warmer waters of the Mediterranean around the same period. Byzantine ships were larger, more enclosed, and operated in conditions that should theoretically have permitted better sanitation infrastructure. Yet accounts from the period describe conditions that would horrify modern readers: accumulated waste, pervasive disease, mortality rates that approached catastrophic levels during extended campaigns. Part of this was temperature. The Mediterranean is warmer than the North Atlantic, and warm conditions accelerate decomposition, bacterial growth, and all the biological processes that turn waste into danger. The Byzantine crew sweating in summer heat was dealing with a more aggressive bacterial environment than the Viking crew shivering in northern waters. But temperature doesn't explain everything. Byzantine ships had enclosed spaces that trapped odours and concentrated contamination. They had larger crews in less space per capita. They had cultural practices around hygiene that, while not necessarily inferior to Norse practices, were different in ways that sometimes proved disadvantageous at sea. Historians still argue about comparative hygiene levels across medieval cultures, but the consensus seems to be that Vikings were at least as clean as their contemporaries, and probably cleaner than many. The archaeological evidence, all those combs and grooming tools, supports this. The written accounts from outside observers, including the famous Ibn Fadlan description that's often misused to portray Vikings as dirty, actually reveal regular washing practices that exceeded many contemporary standards. Arab maritime traditions of the same period emphasized cleanliness in ways that paralleled and sometimes exceeded Norse practices. Islamic law required ablutions that ensured regular washing, and Arab ships sometimes included designated wash areas that Viking vessels lacked. But Arab mariners faced the same basic challenges of waste management at sea, and their solutions weren't dramatically different from Norse approaches. Overboard disposal as primary method, containment systems for emergencies, regular cleaning of shared spaces. Later, European maritime traditions, particularly during the Age of Sail, would develop more sophisticated sanitation systems. Dedicated heads, the raised platforms at the bow where toilets were installed, designated sick bays, and formalised protocols for cleaning and waste management. But these developments came centuries after the Viking Age, and they were often responses to catastrophic disease outbreaks that killed thousands of sailors and forced systematic reform. The Vikings, without any of this formal infrastructure, achieved remarkable results through cultural practices that prioritized cleanliness, ship designs that accidentally facilitated waste management, and social systems that distributed the burden of sanitation work across the entire crew. Compare the Viking approach to English naval practices just a few centuries later. English ships of the Tudor and Stuart periods were notorious for their filthy conditions, with disease killing more sailors than combat in almost every major naval operation. The famous description of conditions aboard ships of the line includes details that make the Viking longship seem positively luxurious by comparison. Why the difference? Several factors probably contributed. Viking voyages were generally shorter than the months-long campaigns of later naval powers. Viking crews were smaller and more cohesive, with social bonds that encouraged mutual responsibility. And Viking culture retained that insistence on personal grooming and cleanliness that, somewhere along the line, other European maritime traditions lost or never developed. The North Atlantic itself may have been an ally. Cold water supported lower bacterial populations than warm. The salt spray that constantly washed Viking decks provided a crude disinfection. The weather that made voyaging dangerous also created conditions somewhat less favourable to the spread of disease. None of this made Viking voyaging healthy by modern standards. People still got sick. People still died. The conditions were still, objectively, terrible. But within the context of their time, Viking sanitation practices were sophisticated, effective, and responsible for survival rates that enabled the remarkable expansion of Norse influence across the medieval world. You're thinking about this as the ship sails onward, comparing what you're experiencing to stories you've heard of voyages in other waters, on other ships, under other flags. The conclusion you're reaching, that you're actually better off here than you might be elsewhere, is both comforting and strange. You're still uncomfortable. You still smell. The conditions are still difficult, but they're survivably difficult, manageably difficult, and that makes all the difference. The Vikings didn't invent maritime sanitation, but they practiced it well, better than many of their contemporaries and many who came after. The systems worked, and the systems working is why you're still here, still sailing, still alive. Let's talk about something that rarely makes it into historical accounts, but was as real as any physical challenge: the psychological burden of living in such close proximity to bodily functions day after day, with no escape and no privacy. You've been at sea for over a week now. In that time, you've watched every single one of your crewmates relieve themselves. You've heard the sounds, smelled the smells, observed the peculiarities that every human body produces when observed without filter. You know more about the digestive processes of these men than you know about many members of your own family, and they know the same about you. This enforced intimacy stripped away layers of social pretense that normally cushioned human interaction. On land, bodily functions were private matters, conducted behind closed doors or at least out of sight. At sea, they were public performances, witnessed and acknowledged and incorporated into the shared experience of the voyage. The psychological adaptation required for this was significant. You had to develop somehow the ability to observe without really seeing, to be present without truly noticing. A kind of collective blindness that allowed people to maintain their dignity despite the constant exposure of their most undignified moments. Humour helped, as humour always does with uncomfortable realities. The jokes that developed around shipboard bodily functions were crude, constant, and apparently necessary, a way of acknowledging what was happening while diffusing its power to embarrass or disturb. You've heard more flatulence jokes in the past week than in the previous year of your life, and you've contributed your share. Historians still argue about the psychological resilience of pre-modern people compared to modern ones, whether constant exposure to difficulty made them harder, or whether the same emotions we feel were simply less documented. The evidence from the sagas suggests that Vikings experienced the same range of emotions we do: shame, embarrassment, pride, disgust. They just developed coping mechanisms for dealing with conditions that would overwhelm most modern people. The songs helped too. Not just the work songs that kept rowing and bailing rhythmic, but the other songs, the evening songs when work was done, the storm songs that kept spirits up during crises, the bawdy songs that celebrated aspects of human existence that polite company wouldn't discuss. Music created community, and community made the difficult bearable. Stories served a similar function. The sagas themselves, the hero tales and mythological narratives that formed the backbone of Norse oral culture, provided a shared world that crew members could inhabit together. Discussions of Odin's sacrifices or Thor's adventures gave people something to think about besides their immediate discomfort. The imagination could travel to Asgard even when the body was stuck on a smelly ship. You've noticed that veteran sailors seem to handle the conditions more easily than newcomers. Part of this is physical adaptation. Bodies actually do adjust to deprivation over time, but part is clearly psychological. They've developed the mental tools for managing extended discomfort, the internal resources that make survival possible. Newcomers are still building those tools, still learning how to endure. The cramped sleeping arrangements, which seemed intolerable at first, have become almost normal. You can sleep now with bodies pressed against you on both sides, adjusting unconsciously when your neighbour moves, waking only for significant disturbances. This adaptation happened without your conscious awareness. One morning you simply realised that what had seemed impossible was now routine. The smell has followed a similar trajectory. At first it was overwhelming, a constant assault on your senses that made concentration difficult. Now it's just there, background. You notice it only when something changes, a new source of odour, a shift in the wind, something that breaks the established pattern. Your brain has learned to filter out the constant and alert you only to the variable. This neurological adaptation is well documented in modern research. Humans genuinely do stop noticing persistent smells, a phenomenon called olfactory fatigue that probably served evolutionary purposes. If you're constantly smelling something, it's probably not a threat. But knowing the science doesn't make the experience less strange. You've become habituated to conditions that your past self would have considered unbearable. The morale challenges were ongoing, though. Even adapted, even adjusted, the extended stress of shipboard life wore on people. Tempers frayed, patience thinned. Minor conflicts that would have been ignored on land could escalate into genuine disputes at sea, where the impossibility of escape concentrated every irritation. The social structures of the crew existed partly to manage these psychological pressures. The hierarchy provided clarity about roles and responsibilities. The rituals, meals, watch rotations, the Saturday bathing tradition when possible, provided structure that made time manageable. The collective identity as a crew, a unit, a band with shared purpose, provided meaning that individual comfort couldn't match. You're grateful for your crewmates, you realise. Not for any specific thing they've done, but for their presence, their shared experience, their willingness to endure the same conditions you're enduring. This voyage would be unbearable alone. Together it's merely very difficult. The psychological burden of proximity to waste was just one strand in a larger web of psychological challenges that Viking voyagers faced. Loneliness, fear, uncertainty, boredom, exhaustion, all of these pressed on the human mind during weeks at sea. The waste proximity was maybe the most visceral, the most immediate, but it was part of a package that tested the limits of human psychological resilience, and the Vikings passed the test mostly. They made voyages that should have broken them, endured conditions that should have been unbearable, and arrived at their destinations sane enough to establish settlements, conduct trade, conduct warfare. The systems worked, not just the physical systems of waste management, but the psychological systems that made endurance possible. You're standing in a museum now. Not really, of course. You're still on the ship. But let's imagine for a moment what future archaeologists will find when they study vessels like this one and the settlements their crews established. The evidence they'll uncover tells a story that the sagas never bothered to record. The story of what people ate, what they excreted, and what that reveals about daily life in the Viking Age. Archaeological study of cesspits, ship remains, and preserved organic matter has given us remarkable insights into Viking sanitation practices. These aren't the glamorous finds that make headlines, no golden treasures or intricate carvings, but they're invaluable for understanding how ordinary people actually lived. The cesspits of Jorvik, the Viking city that occupied what's now York in England, have been particularly informative. Waterlogged conditions preserved organic material that would normally decompose, giving archaeologists access to actual Viking waste from over 1,000 years ago. The analysis revealed diet. Lots of meat, fish, grains. Health, intestinal parasites were common, and even personal habits. Traces of textiles and leather suggest what people used for hygiene purposes. Shipwrecks have provided complementary evidence. The Oseberg ship, discovered in Norway in 1904, contained grave goods that included everyday items: combs, buckets, tools for cooking and cleaning. The presence of such mundane objects in what was clearly an elite burial suggests their importance to daily life. You weren't buried with things that didn't matter. Historians still argue about how to interpret archaeological evidence from settlements versus ships. Conditions differed significantly. A permanent settlement could develop more elaborate sanitation infrastructure than a mobile vessel ever could. But both environments left traces that tell us about Viking attitudes toward cleanliness and waste management. The evidence consistently supports the picture we've been developing. Vikings cared about hygiene, invested effort in maintaining cleanliness, and developed sophisticated practices for managing waste. This wasn't universal or uniform. Some sites show evidence of conditions we'd consider squalid, but the overall pattern suggests a culture that valued cleanliness more than the dirty barbarian stereotype suggests. Preserved textiles have revealed details about Viking clothing and its maintenance. Wool garments showing wear patterns consistent with repeated use. Evidence of repairs that extended garment life. Traces of lanolin suggesting how fabric was treated. All of this adds up to a picture of practical people making the most of their resources. Bone and antler combs, perhaps the most common grooming implement in the archaeological record, appear in contexts ranging from wealthy graves to humble household middens. Their ubiquity suggests that regular combing was near universal, a daily practice that crossed social boundaries. The fine-toothed varieties specifically designed for removing lice appear frequently enough to confirm that the war against parasites was constant and taken seriously. The bilge pump, an innovation that appeared in Scandinavian ships sometime during the Viking Age, represents a technological response to the bailing problem we discussed earlier. Rather than the endless human chain of scoops and buckets, the pump allowed mechanical removal of bilge water with less labour. We don't know exactly when or how this technology spread, but its adoption demonstrates that Vikings continuously refined their maritime practices. Latrine structures at settlement sites show evolution over time, from simple pit toilets to more elaborate arrangements with drainage and some privacy. These were land-based solutions that couldn't be replicated aboard ships, but they demonstrate the cultural trajectory. As resources allowed, Vikings invested in better sanitation infrastructure. The evidence from human remains themselves is revealing in ways that might seem macabre, but are scientifically valuable. Skeletal analysis shows generally good nutrition by medieval standards. Dental health was better than many contemporary populations, suggesting either dietary advantages or active dental care. Height and build data indicate a population that, whatever their hygiene challenges, was not systematically debilitated by disease. All of this archaeological evidence, accumulated over more than a century of excavation and analysis, paints a picture of Viking life that's much more nuanced than popular culture usually allows. These weren't primitive savages barely surviving in filth. They were sophisticated people with developed cultural practices addressing every aspect of daily life, including the unglamorous business of waste management. The ship you're on right now might, 1,000 years from now, be the subject of archaeological study. If it survives, sunk in preserving waters, buried in anaerobic mud, future scientists might analyse the traces it contains. They might find evidence of what you ate last week, traces of the herbs you rubbed into your clothing, residue in the bilge that tells stories you never thought to write down. That's a strange thought, isn't it? That the most mundane aspects of your existence, your waste, your garbage, your cast-off possessions, might be the most valuable record you leave behind. The sagas will tell the heroic stories, the poetry will capture the emotions, but the cesspits will reveal the truth of how you actually lived. The ship sails on, accumulating the traces that will someday become evidence. The bilge fills with residue. The bucket leaves its marks. The combs shed teeth that will be found a millennium hence. You are, without meaning to, creating the archaeological record of your own existence. The legacy of Viking sanitation practices extends far beyond the Viking Age itself, influencing Scandinavian maritime traditions for centuries and leaving traces in naval practices that persist to the present day. The Scandinavian countries, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, remained significant maritime powers long after the Viking Age formally ended. Their sailors inherited not just ships and routes, but the accumulated wisdom of how to live aboard vessels for extended periods. The practices we've been discussing didn't disappear when the longships gave way to different designs. They evolved, adapted, and continued. The Hanseatic League, a powerful trading confederation that dominated northern European commerce in the medieval and early modern periods, included significant Scandinavian participation. Scandinavian sailors, carrying their maritime traditions, contributed to the practices that became standard across the League's fleet. The emphasis on cleanliness, the rotating duty systems, the practical approaches to shipboard hygiene, all of these had Norse roots that persisted through centuries of development. Historians still argue about direct lines of transmission versus parallel development, whether specific practices can be traced directly from Viking ships to later vessels, or whether similar conditions simply produce similar solutions independently. The truth probably involves both. Some practices were directly inherited, while others were reinvented because they worked. The naval regulations that began appearing in Scandinavian countries during the medieval period codified practices that had previously been customary. Requirements for deck washing, protocols for waste disposal, rules about who cleaned what and when. These formal regulations were giving legal force to expectations that had been enforced informally for generations. When Europeans began the great age of oceanic exploration in the 15th and 16th centuries, they faced maritime challenges that Vikings had confronted 500 years earlier. The solutions they developed, or failed to develop, often echoed Norse approaches. Ships that maintained cleanliness survived better. Crews that distributed sanitation work cooperatively functioned better. The patterns that worked for the Vikings worked for later sailors too, but the transmission wasn't perfect, and the learning wasn't complete. Many later naval traditions failed to maintain the standards that Vikings had achieved, resulting in the notorious filth of sailing vessels during the Age of Exploration. Ships from England, Spain, Portugal, and the Netherlands developed reputations for conditions that Vikings would have found intolerable. Why the regression? Several factors probably contributed. Ships got larger, with crews less closely bound by the social ties that encouraged mutual care among Vikings. Voyages got longer, straining resources and exhausting whatever cleaning routines existed. Naval hierarchies became more rigid, with lower-ranking sailors bearing disproportionate sanitation burdens that bred resentment rather than cooperation. The recovery came gradually, through the hard lessons of disease and mortality. When ship captains noticed that clean ships had lower death rates, they imposed cleanliness. When naval administrators calculated the cost of losing trained sailors to preventable disease, they mandated sanitation protocols. The knowledge that Vikings had possessed as cultural inheritance had to be painfully relearned as institutional policy. Modern maritime sanitation regulations, the comprehensive rules governing waste treatment, water quality and hygiene on contemporary vessels, represent the endpoint of a development that began, in some ways, with those Viking sailors going to the rail with a buddy rope. The specific practices have evolved beyond recognition. Modern ships have flush toilets connected to treatment systems. Potable water is purified to standards Vikings couldn't have imagined. Climate control keeps temperatures and humidity at levels that discourage bacterial growth. But the underlying principles — contain waste, maintain cleanliness, distribute responsibility — remain continuous with what happened on the longship beneath you. You're part of this lineage, you realise. The practices you're engaging in, the systems you're participating in, the adaptations you're making, these are contributing to a body of knowledge that will persist and evolve long after you're gone. Every voyage adds to the accumulated wisdom. Every solution discovered becomes available to those who come after. The Vikings didn't set out to influence naval sanitation practices for the next 1,000 years. They were just trying to survive, trying to cross dangerous waters without dying of disease, trying to maintain enough hygiene to function in impossibly close quarters. But their solutions worked, and working solutions get remembered, get passed down, get built upon. The ship sails on, and the legacy accumulates. The future is being shaped by practices developed in the present, which itself was shaped by practices from the past. It's a chain of transmission stretching across centuries, and you're a link in it. That's worth something, isn't it? Even if you never think of it that way. Even if the work feels mundane and the conditions feel miserable, and the whole enterprise seems like just another voyage, you're contributing to something larger than yourself. Before we begin our descent into sleep, let's pause for one final collection of stranger-than-fiction details about Viking hygiene. The odd bits that didn't fit elsewhere but are too fascinating to leave out. Urine, for instance. Vikings used human urine for several purposes that might strike modern listeners as bizarre, but made perfect practical sense. Aged urine, collected and left to stand until its ammonia content concentrated, served as a cleaning agent and mordant for dyeing textiles. The ammonia broke down oils and set dyes in ways that other available substances couldn't match. There's some evidence that urine was also used for laundry purposes, the ammonia acting as a primitive bleach and degreaser. This was common across many ancient cultures, not unique to the Norse, but it represents the kind of waste not want not philosophy that characterized practical Viking life. Why throw away something that could serve a purpose, even if that something was literally your own waste product? Historians still argue about the extent of these practices during voyages versus in permanent settlements. Using urine for textile processing aboard ships seems unlikely, the space and time requirements would be prohibitive, but the cultural acceptance of urine as a useful substance probably influenced attitudes toward waste more broadly. It wasn't just garbage, it was potential resource. The toothpick rituals we mentioned earlier deserve more attention. Archaeological finds include specialized dental implements, bone or metal picks designed specifically for cleaning between teeth, that appear in contexts suggesting regular use. The Vikings apparently were fussier about their teeth than their reputation might suggest. Ear cleaning was similarly ritualized. The ear spoons found in archaeological sites, tiny scoops designed to remove earwax, appear in such numbers that regular ear cleaning must have been expected. These weren't tools for occasional use. They were everyday implements, as essential as combs for hair. Nail care shows up in the archaeological record too. Grooming kits containing small knives or files appropriate for nail trimming suggest attention to hygiene details that extended to the extremities. Clean, trimmed nails might have been markers of social status or simply expectations of civilized behaviour. We can't know for certain, but their maintenance was clearly a priority. The sagas mention that Norsemen were mocked by English observers for being excessively attentive to their appearance, bathing too often, combing too carefully, changing clothes too frequently. Whether this was genuine cultural difference or simply English sour grapes over Viking military and romantic successes is debatable, but the complaint itself confirms that Norse hygiene standards were noticeably high. Some truly odd practices appear in the historical and mythological sources. Belief in the protective properties of certain bodily fluids, rituals involving the ceremonial handling of waste, superstitions about what improper sanitation might attract in terms of supernatural displeasure, these sit at the intersection of hygiene and religion that characterized much of pre-modern sanitation thought. Hair had particular significance beyond mere hygiene. Long hair, well maintained, was a marker of status and sometimes of religious or social identity. Cutting someone's hair against their will was a serious insult, a degradation that went beyond aesthetics into the realm of personal honour. The constant combing, therefore, wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about identity. Vikings apparently had strong opinions about personal smell, specifically about not smelling bad. References in the sagas to characters being insulted for their body odour suggest that this was a meaningful category of social criticism. You could damage someone's reputation by accusing them of stinking, which implies that not stinking was an expected social norm. The hygiene differences between social classes were probably less pronounced in the Viking world than in many contemporary cultures. The nature of shipboard life, which we've been exploring throughout this journey, created a democratizing effect. Everyone was exposed to the same conditions, used the same systems, and confronted the same challenges. The Earl's son and the farmhand both went to the rail. These strange details, collectively, paint a picture of a culture that thought carefully about the body and its maintenance. The Vikings weren't sophisticated in their theoretical understanding. They didn't know about germs or understand the mechanisms of disease, but they were sophisticated in their practical approaches, developing systems and customs that achieved remarkably good results, without the scientific knowledge that would make sense of why. You're carrying some of these practices with you right now. The comb you use daily, the attention to your nails and ears, the cultural expectation that you'll maintain yourself even when conditions make maintenance difficult. These are inheritances from a tradition that valued the well-kept body, that saw personal hygiene as both practical necessity and social obligation. The stranger-than-fiction details aren't really so strange when you understand the culture that produced them. They're practical solutions to practical problems, filtered through the available materials and inherited beliefs of their time. The urine laundry, the ear spoons, the toothpicks, all of these made sense in context. All of them represented the best available approaches to maintaining human bodies in a world without modern conveniences. And now you know about them, which means they're part of your inheritance too. The sun is setting finally, painting the western horizon in shades of orange and gold that reflect off the endless water in patterns you've never quite seen before and will probably never see again. The ship moves gently now, the day's winds giving way to the evening calm, and around you the sounds of activity are dying down as the crew prepares for night. This feels like the right moment to pause, to stop examining the details and simply exist here, on this vessel, in this moment, part of a voyage that has been going on for generations before you, and will continue in some form for generations after. The systems we've been exploring, all those unglamorous details about waste and water and washing, have faded into the background where they belong. You've internalized them now. The rope by the rail is just there, available when needed. The bucket is stowed in its corner, ready for emergencies. The bailing rotation will continue tomorrow as it did today. These aren't things you think about anymore. They're just part of life, as automatic as breathing. That's how survival works, really. You develop routines that handle the difficult things, and then the difficult things stop feeling difficult. What seemed impossible at the start of this voyage, the intimacy, the smells, the constant proximity to processes you'd rather ignore, has become simply normal. You've adapted, as humans always do, to conditions that seemed unbearable. The crew around you is settling into evening rhythms. Someone is humming a low melody, probably not even conscious of making the sound. Others are positioning themselves for sleep, claiming their spots, wrapping themselves in cloaks against the chill that comes with darkness. The ship continues its slow progress, requiring minimal attention during the calm night hours. You find yourself feeling something unexpected. Gratitude. Not gratitude for the conditions, which remain objectively difficult, but gratitude for the community that makes them bearable. These men, and they're still somewhat strangers, even after all this time together, have become your world. Their presence, their participation in the shared systems, their willingness to endure alongside you. These are gifts you couldn't have appreciated before the voyage began. The ocean stretches dark and vast around you, impossibly large, indifferent to your small presence upon it. There's something humbling about that vastness, something that puts personal concerns in perspective. The smells that bothered you, the discomforts that grated, the thousand small indignities of shipboard life, they shrink against that immensity. You're here, you're alive, you're crossing waters that most people will never see. Everything else is detail. The stars are emerging now, first one and then dozens and then more than you can count. The familiar patterns that have guided sailors since before memory. You recognize the constellations, or most of them, these same stars that shine over your homeland, over the destination you're approaching, over every place you've ever been or ever will be. They're constants in a world of change. Tomorrow there will be more work, more challenges, more adaptation required. But tomorrow can wait. Tonight is for rest, for the recovery that makes tomorrow possible. Your body knows this, settling into sleep position without your conscious direction, finding the comfortable arrangement it's learned through repetition. The sounds of the ship fade into white noise, the creak of wood, the lap of water, the soft breathing of your crewmates. These sounds have become a kind of music, the lullaby of the sea, and they carry you downward towards sleep with gentle insistence. The Vikings crossed oceans on ships like this one. They discovered new lands, established new settlements, created a civilization that stretched from the Arctic to the Mediterranean, and they did it all while managing the basic biological realities of human existence, the eating and drinking and waste producing that every body demands. Those systems, humble as they were, made everything else possible. The legendary voyages, the historic discoveries, the cultural achievements that echo through centuries, all of them rested on the foundation of people figuring out how to stay alive in challenging conditions. The sagas don't celebrate this. The poems don't sing of it, but without it, there would have been no sagas, no poems, no legends at all. You are part of that story now. A small part, perhaps, one voyage among thousands, one sailor among tens of thousands. But you're here, participating in the systems, contributing to the tradition, adding your experience to the accumulated wisdom that makes Norse voyaging possible. The last light fades from the sky. The stars wheel overhead, keeping their ancient patterns. The ship continues its gentle motion, rocking you like a cradle, carrying you through darkness toward whatever dawn will bring. Let your eyes close now. Let your breathing slow. Let the weight of the day drift away like spray from the bow. You've done well. You've survived another day at sea, managed the conditions, contributed to the collective effort. Tomorrow will bring more of the same, and you'll meet it as you met today, with adaptation, with humour, with the practical determination that defines life on the open water. Sleep now. Rest. Dream of harbours and home and the fresh water waiting at the next landfall. The ocean holds you. The ship carries you. The night embraces you. Sweet dreams.